Yeah. Good morning, everybody, on this very nice sunny day, very exceptional for Belgium, so enjoy it. Although, unfortunately, you have to stay inside here. But I'm sure that you will be compensated more than enough because we have a very challenging and interesting uh, day ahead here with our talking about China's innovation and industrial policy and the consequences for that for Europe. I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the first session here, and my purpose of this introduction is to actually overload you with a lot of numbers here, just to show you how big the achievements are of China in terms of science and innovation here, and what this means in terms of challenges here. I've been following this since a long time, and I have to say I was also still shocked by the numbers in terms of the size of the achievement and the challenges ahead here. But nevertheless, I think the challenges are something that we can deal with as Europe here. So that was my main message, but now I'd like to have the numbers for my slides. So if I can get these. Yes, so the next slide. So I would like to first... Okay. I have to speak louder? Yeah, okay. So overall, a very key indicator that we usually trace in terms of science, technology, and innovation is our spending on research and development as a percentage of GDP here. So in the green bar, you always see how Europe is doing, and this is Europe 27, so it's without the UK, what the trend is in terms of how we are doing here. But then on the blue part, you see the position relative to China here. China is always expressed as 100, so if Europe scores higher than 100, we have a lead. Below, we are having a lag here. So overall, in terms of spending of research and development, the good news is we've made a bit of progress here, but could also see it on half full, half empty here, is that the progress has been very slow. And if you look at in terms of the lead position, we used to have still a small lead in 2015, but it has gone to a lag in terms of 2022 here. Most of the problem that we actually are facing is not in the government-financed R&D, though I have to say that the numbers from the OECD for China in terms of government-financed are bit more difficult to compare here, but for the business performed R&D, that's actually where, although we made a little bit of progress, we are still very much running behind, and certainly also relative to the US here, and also relative to China here. So that's where actually we've seen most of the forging ahead of China here. So it's really also in this business performed R&D. Now, if you look more into the components, and let's start with science here, because science is the base to which a lot of new innovative ideas will actually grow from. In terms of the share of world science publications, on average, we're not doing that bad, but we're going down in terms of our share on world publications. And you see, again, if you compare it with China, a massive rise in number of publications, such that actually our initial lead position relative to China has gone really seriously down here. Now, we very often hear that that's in terms of quantity of publications. If we really look at the quality, and typical indicator to look at that is the most cited scientific publications. And I'm really looking at the skew here with the top 1% most cited science publications here. Also there, Europe has actually lost a little bit position in total, but you see that also there we had a very strong advantage over China here in 2015, but also that we really lost substantially here. So it's not just quantity, it's also in quality here. And actually the Economist will have a big issue on that in their upcoming version for this week here. And then, of course, if you go a bit more into the details of which scientific fields, and if you really look at what are identified as strategic areas here, so that, of course, is all the digital technologies here. And if you look at AI, that's definitely a battlefield science and technology area in the future here. There, Europe is actually doing not too badly in terms of scientific publications. It's a bit different in terms of patents, but in terms of scientific publications, and so the scientific strength in Europe in 2015 was really pretty good, even better than the US here, but we've lost it over time here. And again, if you look at the lead over relative to China, so in the blue area, you see we had a lead in AI over China in 2015, but we lost that also and really lost substantially here too. Another very strategic area is the biomedical area here. There we still are very strong, and we used to be very strong, although there the game is more with how strong are we relative to the US. But relative to China, we really had a very strong advantage. But also there, we actually are losing a position relative to China. So China is also, although it's still pretty recent, but still we see there also an increase in the position of China in this biomedical area here. Then in terms of world top universities, because that's where you train the skills that will actually go into industry and innovation later on here. So there, Europe has been more or less stable. If you look at the share that we have of top universities in the Shanghai ranking here, we used to have a very strong lead over China here. Of course, the US dominates this ranking completely here, but the lead of even Europe relative to China was really substantial. We see we still have a lead, but it is also seriously reduced here. So you see the progression and really the speed of progress of Europe in terms of science here. If we then go one step further in terms of inventions here, and then we typically look at patent applications. I will not go into too much detail because that will be more than thoroughly discussed in the next presentations here. But overall there we see again the rise of China in terms of patent inventions here. We used to have a lead in 2015, but also that has seriously reduced here. And then if you go really into the AI patents, here, so I already told you that in terms of science, we were not doing so badly. But if you take a look at the patents, so the way we can actually turn this AI knowledge into patent inventive, Europe only had 5% of all the world international patent families in AI. And there, of course, we really are in a very strong lagging position relative to China here. So can I then have the next slide, which goes more into this innovation performance? And for that, we really look at the R&D scoreboard information, which traces all the large R&D spenders over the world across time and across countries and sectors. So first of all, if you look at the bold numbers here, that's overall here. In terms of the number of companies we have in this scoreboard of largest R&D spenders, so we're going down here, which means we're losing relative to others, and that's the US and China here. And you see definitely also relative to China, because in the blue bars you see how much we actually are losing positions in that top ranking relative to China. So our more or less, we were more or less on equal position in 2017, but now we only have half of the positions that the Chinese companies have here. If you take a look in terms of R&D spending, that's still we had a very strong lead here, because the companies we had in that sector, in that ranking also were spending way more. So the China may have had more companies in this sector, but they were still relatively small in terms of R&D here. But also there you see that actually we're now at par in terms of the total amounts of R&D spent by these corporate largest spenders here. We are same size as China here. So again, massive progression here. And then if you take into account how much sales these innovative companies are actually realizing, again, there we used to have a lead, but also that lead has actually turned to a parity position relative to China here. Then if we go into, and that's my final point, if we go into more the different sectors here, and again, digital is a very important sector, and digital is both hardware as well as software. So we're good. you see that actually the weak position of Europe is actually because of its weak position in the digital sectors here. You see that, so that's the red numbers here. You see that in terms of numbers. You see that in terms of how much R&D spent in this sector here and how much sales to be made for that. This was already very low, didn't go further down much, but still it was very low. And this is really all in competition, mostly with the US, but also with China here. So already in terms of number of firms, also relative to China, we had a serious lag here, and that lag has only gotten worse. In terms of R&D, the lag was not so big in terms of 2017, but also that has gone really substantially down here, and the same for sales here. So in digital, that's really where we are missing not only the number of players here, but also the players with substantial R&D and sales realized in these sectors here. That's particularly compared to the US because we're missing these big tech, but also compared to China here. Then, as already said, biomedical, we used to be very strong in terms of science here. If you look at the innovation capacity of firms in this sector here, there we see that in 2017 we really had still a serious leading position relative to China here. Although, of course, here the real competition is with the US, but nevertheless, relative to China, we still had a very strong position here, but that has, in terms of number of firms, also completely vanished and turned into also a leading position for China here. In terms of, these are all still very small companies, because if we look at how much is spent in terms of innovation, R&D in this biomedical sector here, we used to have really a tremendous benefit over the small players, a few players that China had in 2017. This has also gone considerably down, but it's still an important lead. It's just measuring the very initial catch-up that China's realizing in that sector here. It's very fast. They're still not there yet. They're still relatively small too, and missing the large biopharma companies here, but you see how fast that it goes down here. If you compare it with digital, I don't know how long it will take before this will also be a lead here. And then finally, bit of positive news to end with if you look at the automobiles, because that's a very important sector for Europe as well. So there, in terms of number of firms, we are as important in terms of number of innovation active firms, we are as important as China here, and that has been pretty stable. We were very strong in terms of how much the R&D intensity of our companies in automobiles here, a very strong lead over China here, but also that has gone down over time. It's still there in terms of R&D spending and in terms of sales, but it's also going down. And if you take into account that a lot of trends in that sector comes from the electric vehicles and from the autonomous driving, the combination with the digital here, it's very unclear how long we can actually are able to sustain that comparative advantage that we still have over China in that very important sector. And the discussion these days on the tariffs on the electric vehicle clearly illustrates this. So I thought that these numbers will really be kind of good shock to know what we are talking about in terms of the achievements here. So it's always a good idea not to underestimate your rival firm, your rival here. And so it's very clear these achievements are very substantial here. It is quite challenging here, but also the numbers, at least here and there, also indicate that Europe is still up to the challenge here. So that's what we will be discussing in more detail during this day here. So I hope I've incentivized you to why it's a good idea, despite the good weather, to be here. I now give the floor to Alicia, who will manage.
Thank you, Reinhilde. First of all, I'm not sure we can continue this meeting after all of those bad news, but we are going to, because at the end of the day, for two reasons. First, because we're going to include the US in the equation, so it's going to be even harder and tougher. Second, because numbers are numbers, and in fact, the work we have conducted with Robin Shindowski and Michał, both for a project financed by the European Commission, for which we are really, really thankful, we're going to really move beyond numbers to to novelty. That's the concept we're going to develop here in this first part of our seminar, to not to change that, because it's not going to fully change that, but it's going to perhaps add a little bit of quality indicators into the equation of where are we in Europe in terms of innovation. So I'm going to start right away with an intro very briefly, then I'll give the floor to my co-authors. This is just work in progress, by the way, and not to be attributed yet or let alone cited, because we don't have a paper yet, so it's going to be very hard to cite it anyway. So next slide. Yeah, so if we could see the presentation, otherwise I'll have to do it by heart, which I don't think I can. But yeah, so let me use the seconds. Oh, sorry, I thought they were moving them. Robin, you're such a wonderful. Well, if you can't, then I'm saved, because it looks really stupid. No, can we upload the presentation, please? Sure, 1 minute. So I can use that 1 minute to say that what we're doing. So first of all, for this project called DWORK, so dealing with resurgent China. So, you know, the title itself is of our consortium for the European Union, says it all about what you just said, yeah? It's like this strength. I mean, China is becoming so strong globally. What can we say? And this is not the right presentation. Yeah, this is industrial policy. We need the other one, thank you, on innovation. If you bear with us for 2 sessions today, you'll hear about industrial policy. But we're going to start with innovation, which is really work in progress. Industrial policy has a number of papers already out. And we really want your comments on innovation, because it's a pretty hard cookie. In fact, I mean, most publications would come up with, you know, an increasing gap between Europe and China in many ways. And what we're trying to do here is narrowing down, becoming more granular as to which technologies we really care about. Not that they are the best for Europe, but we think that they are relevant also for policy reasons. So we're focusing on emerging technologies. Tim will have a lot to say on this. And we're focusing on 3 because these are the technologies that basically are at the center of our economic security strategy, whether in Europe or in the US. That's why we choose this section, these technologies. You can guess them: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, semiconductors. Well, we only focus on those technologies. Not that they're the best for Europe. So what we show about Europe might be biased by the choice of the technologies, but we do think that if you want to build on economic security for technologies that you don't even have a strength on, maybe that's not going to be very helpful in terms of using economic security. So we want to also, hopefully with your help, draw some lessons on the policy implications of where China stands compared to Europe, compared to the US in these particular technologies. So that's kind of the rationale for our work. So again, AI, quantum computing, and semiconductors. And again, the core of the US export control machinery. This is Blinken's small yard, high fence. We added, we Europeans, because we know about our maybe previous advantage, if I hear you, Reinhilde, but still some, on biotech. So we added biotech to these 3 technologies, but we're not, I mean the European Union or the European Commission, we're not exploring biotech for the lack of time, by the way, because this is an immensely data-intensive work that had to be conducted mostly by my colleagues. So I just can't even imagine how much data they've crunched on this one. Economic security strategy, so as I said, including biotechnology, June 2023. And then, I want to go to the roadmap of what we are going to hear in the next few minutes. So we're going to measure, and Mikael will explain you how this is done. This is basically LLM models, the novelty of patent abstracts. He can explain why we use abstract rather than a full patent, but in essence, that's what we do with large language models. And we skip traditional indicators, such as citations, and we're going to show you why we do that. On top of that, our concept of novelty exactly because we want to understand whether it makes sense to impose export controls. I mean, it makes sense if you have a radical novelty that is hard to replicate, because if it's very easy to replicate, maybe it doesn't work. So we have a policy rationale behind the methodology we use, the data we use, everything. So radical novelty. And then going back to the idea of can we stop? Or not that I'm claiming here we want to stop China. It's just that we're just basically looking at whether these economic security strategies are going in the right direction based on the ability to reduce the spillovers of novelties. I should drink. Lots of things happening in between. But so, thank you. Spillovers is the second thing we do in this paper, which is literally look at patent diffusion, if I may use that word, across jurisdictions. So from the US to Europe, from the US to China. And we're going to do that per field of innovation within the big three themes that I just mentioned. So we're not going to average everything because it loses relevance. We want to see whether some specific innovations within AI have a much longer time to spill over across jurisdictions. In that one, you may have a chance if you impose export controls, or if you use other types of maybe outbound investment screening, you name it. But if the spillover is immediate, frankly, I don't know whether. So, of course, we lack in our analysis, to be very frank, and I finish here, in which sectors we really have export controls, because this is really, we would even need a more granular analysis to do that. So we're not really incorporating the export controls. We're just looking at every single field within these three sectors. I hope I was clear, because now it's going to get only harder for you. My part was the easiest. So I think I've gone through the implications. So really, what to expect from these emerging technologies? Where are we in Europe? Does our economic security strategy make any sense? And so on and so forth. So that's what we are going to hear based on data and a lot of nitty-gritty that is going to start right now. So Robin, the floor is yours.
Okay, so the motivation for our project was that essentially there's a little bit of a mystery. We see that China, and this adds on what Reinhilde just presented, we see that China has increased its R&D spending. It's now one of the top R&D spenders in the world, so these are the top 7 R&D spenders, and China is worldwide on number 6. And then it has surpassed the European Union, is catching up, it seems, with the United States, although the United States is also increasing its R&D spending. Then in terms of, we just mentioned it, highly cited papers, China has increased its standing by far. I mean, it's now number 1, and the US has declined in its share in highly cited patents. Highly cited papers, sorry. Then here we have patent filed by technology field and by country. It's not really visible, but it's very interesting that in almost all technology fields, Chinese patenting is very, very strong. But this, of course, is the key of our analysis. We want to see not only how much China is patenting, but whether these patents are actually impactful. And we try to do this with natural language processing. So this so far looks very good for China, but if we look a bit closer at other indicators, we see that, for example, WIPO, the Global Innovation Index, only ranks China in position number 12. So it's not as good as for example, scientific publications and patenting would suggest. And one of the reasons may be that China's R&D spending is still heavily biased towards applied and developmental research. And applied and developmental research is usually associated with incremental innovation. So innovation that is still an innovation, but it's not a breakthrough innovation from which to expect a lot of spillover effects across the economy. if we look at companies, so these are top R&D spenders, but they are ranked not based on the R&D spending, but on the change in R&D spending from 2022 to 2023. So we wanted to get a bit of a forward-looking component in there. And if we look at some of the sectors, for example, software and ICT services, we see that this is a sector that is still very much dominated by the United States, by United States companies. We see Tencent is still there. Tencent has been in an upward trend since a long time, but we also see some of the let's say losers of the tech crackdown in China, Alibaba and Baidu. Alibaba not doing really anything in terms of changing R&D spending, and Baidu spending less on R&D actually. Then when we look at computer hardware and communications, traditionally a very strong field within the Chinese manufacturing sector, we see it looks a bit better for China. I mean, we have big companies like Xiaomi and ZTE and Hikvision. Hikvision is the producer of the surveillance cameras, which China has been selling throughout the world in many countries. Huawei is also there, but then there are some companies like Foxconn who are actually reducing their R&D spending, and it's still mixed. I mean, there's still some US companies. In biotechnology and life sciences, I mean, we've just talked about it. China is not really there. I mean, there are some Chinese companies. They tend to be relatively small in terms of R&D spending, in terms of size as well. And the US and Europe are still the dominant force here. Then, of course, for us Europeans, the big topic is automobiles. And here we see within the top R&D spenders, the big winners of yesterday's tariff contest. BYD at the top, Volvo in the middle of it, and then SAIC is, well, they're doing what they did when the EU Commission asked them to cooperate, namely nothing, and the rest is dominated by US and European companies. So then we have industrial, electronic, and electric machinery. And there, the size of European and US companies is still very large, and Chinese companies are only picking up now within initiatives such as the 10,000 Little Giants initiative to gain a significant size. Other companies, we have Meituan, PetroChina, and some other big R&D spenders, but there the picture is really still very mixed. So it's not very clear whether China has really advanced in significance in innovation capacity, but if we look at different indicators, we get a mixed picture. So usually, in order to look at the innovation capacity of a country, patents have been used widely, and in order to check the significance of a patent, a traditional indicator is patent citations. There have been some seminal papers written of that. I'm citing them here, but essentially, one of the issues with patent citations is that there are different practices across patent offices, and this makes it sometimes a bit hard to compare which country is actually getting ahead. One can mitigate this a bit by looking at PCT patents, so patents filed under the Patent Cooperation Treaty. But then there's an issue there's an issue of selection bias, because some companies might actually file their patents within the US local office, and so then we omit some of the patents that are filed there. Also, some applicants might cite strategically in order to maximize the expected value of their patents. And then another paper from Kuhn et al. 2020 found out that actually the technological relatedness, and they do this also with natural language processing, between a citing and a cited patent has decreased over time. So this introduces an additional bias. So all of this justifies for the usage of new techniques, and we have been progressing quite strongly throughout the last 10 years in terms of natural language processing. And there have been mainly two approaches in the literature. One is a similarity-based approach by Kelly et al. 2021. So basically the semantic content of a patent is projected into a vector space, and then it is checked whether this patent is very unsimilar to previous patents. And based on that, the novelty of the patent is inferred, and then it is also considered how much this patent is then similar to subsequent patents in order to see whether it is very impactful in terms of the semantics. And then there's the keyword-based approach by Ars et al., also from KU Leuven, who look at the essential technical terms within a patent and check whether these terms have occurred previously in a patent, or whether they, in order to infer the novelty, and then whether these terms are also replicated in subsequent patents. And we use a bit of a, so we adjust the use of textual analysis for pattern analysis a bit by using large language models, which have increasingly become interesting for these analyses. And we expect that large language models would improve a bit on the semantics. So essentially what we're doing is we're trying to use the large language model in order to infer the essential innovation of a patent. And we also use a large language model in order to classify the technology fields, because if we use a standardized classification from WIPO, it is not granular enough for our approach. We really want to get down to where exactly within semiconductors is China doing innovation compared to the US and to the EU. And Mikhail is now going to explain you what our methodology and the results are.
Okay, thank you, Robin, for this introduction. I think.
Yes, no. I think that's working.
Yes, you should. Can you hear me? All right. Okay, should be okay. So thank you, Robin, for this introduction. So now I will get more into details of what we did. But basically, to answer these questions of the dominance of different countries and regions in AI, quantum computing, and semiconductors, we decided to use the most recent developments in AI. So we are already using what we are analyzing. So I would split the methodology in 4 quick steps. The first one, what is the data set we are working on? So we had 2 parts of this data set. We used all the historical PCT patents from 1979 to 2022. So PCT, these are international patents which cover an innovation in multiple countries. On top of that, we collected the most recent patents in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and semiconductors from 2019 and to 2024. So we have even patents from this year. And we used, again, large language models to select the right patents from the whole database, because there is no classification into AI, quantum computing, and semiconductors. So we analyzed the abstracts of the patents to know if they belong to one of these categories. So, so already at the selection stage, we used LLMs. Secondly, we processed all the historical patents and all the most recent patents to extract the main innovation from the abstracts. We used abstracts because this is the summary of the patent. So this is the most informative part of the textual data that we have. And the large language models, of course, we tested many of them, gave us the main keywords describing the innovation. And the big advantage of large language models is that it understands semantics. So we are not just working with a keyword, but so for example, if we are talking about the car and in another patent about automobile, so these models understand that this is the same, basically. So this is very helpful in the correct classification of the innovation. And finally, we created what Alicia mentioned, innovation fields or innovation classes. These are the clusters of similar innovations. So it was done automatically. We didn't invent any fields of, or we didn't have any list. It was automatically calculated and created using these models. Then we introduced 2 definitions for our analysis. The first one was the novelty. So for the novelty, we checked every patent from from 2019 to 2024, we checked if the innovation extracted by language models appeared in the previous patents. If it didn't, and if it was repeated afterwards, so it means that this was important enough for the future progress of the innovation, then we considered it as a novelty. Just one quick note on the novelty. Our concept is much more radical than in other research papers because for us it's a, let's say, binary decision. It has to be a very novel, and it has to introduce something completely new to the innovation space. So our definition, I would say, is very radical. We focus only on the breakthrough concepts. And secondly, we calculated the innovation spillover. So this is the average number of days that is needed to find a repetition of this novelty concept in another patent between countries. So this is, again, what Alicia explained in the very beginning. So now I will move to the results that we obtained. So first of all, we checked what is the share of the novelty between countries in these three fields. So we can see that in all of them are dominated by the United States, and Europe has a very low share of this novel innovation. In the space of artificial intelligence, it's in the last 1 or 2 years, it's even accelerating. So we see the peak of novelties. For the other domains, quantum computing and semiconductors, it's quite stable, and the share with some small changes is remaining almost the same. Then we calculated also the difference between the United States and other regions to see if the difference is accelerating or not. And we see that in artificial intelligence, the United States are accelerating and taking advantage over other countries from 2021, 2022. So it's getting even faster. For quantum computing, it's quite stable. For semiconductors, we see a small peak from 2021, but now it's becoming more stable. So especially in artificial intelligence, we see that the United States are really taking the lead over other countries. Secondly, we wanted also to understand within each sector, AI, quantum, and semiconductors, what are the fields, the innovation classes, which are dominated by some countries. So here we see the artificial intelligence industry, and these are some fields. So these are the aggregated concepts. We are not talking about the specific technologies, but the clusters of technologies. So, for example, we see that China is very strong in computer vision and image technology. So, for example, medical imaging and all these sectors of AI. However, we are here focusing only on the top fields. Of course, there are many more, but these are the most important ones. We can also, so we see that the computer vision is mostly a point of focus for China. The other fields are dominated by the US. Europe is still marginal in all of them. For quantum computing, it's a little bit different. Again, we see the dominance of the US in all the fields because they dominate generally all these sectors. But here we see that Europe is much stronger in optical computing and robotics. So there are some patents coming from these fields or innovation classes. So we see the share a bit bigger than in artificial intelligence. Then in semiconductors, the split is again different. China putting lots of effort on the display technologies. And we see that Europe is quite strong in optoelectronics. This is a subsector of photonics. So this is mostly because of some big companies which are very important for these sectors, working on these topics. And then finally, we come to the spillover time. So I don't know if you can see, maybe some charts are quite small, but there are some just important learnings that we can see here. So we are checking the time that it takes for a patent from the United States to be repeated in the European Union or in China. And we see some sectors which are quite interesting. I will focus only on them. So, for example, in artificial intelligence, the spillover time in a data science topic, so data analytics and so on, between the US and Europe is very short. So it means that there are lots of cooperation in this field. Again, for cybersecurity, US and Europe is quite short, while US and China is very long. So it means that there are a very different paths of development of innovation in this space, and so there is probably a very good reason for that. We see like similar trends, for example, in quantum computing. Again, the subfield of cybersecurity is quite connected between the US and Europe, and disconnected with China. There are other fields where China is Chinese patents are much closer to the US, like the optical computing and so on. So from this chart, we can see what are the cooperation zones and what are the where we can find the focus between the countries. We can see also some interesting trends if we check if the patent has an origin from China. So again, if a Chinese company publishes a patent on, for example, cryptography, then we see that it's very quickly repeated in the United States. So we see that the US companies are following very closely what is happening in China. However, the European companies take much more time to work on the similar technologies. So we see that the direction is changing very much from one country to another. And fortunately, it doesn't work anymore. Okay, it works. Yes, too many graphs, so it it blocked me. Okay, so this is the time that I finalize.
This is for the very few patents novelties.
Novelties. We are talking only on novelties, not about all the patents. So this is about these breakthrough novel concepts. Yes, and finally, if we check Europe, I think one of the most striking things is that if we talk about the foundations of quantum computing, there's a very strong link between EU and US, which is quite easy to explain by the links between companies. And for example, we can also see that in semiconductors industry, China is repeating the patents in the memory technology. So this is a subfield of semiconductors, which is going, let's say, from Europe to China. But then it really depends on the field. Okay, so what are the implications of all the results? And I leave the floor to Alicia.
So maybe I just wanted to highlight. Sorry, my thank you. I'll be very brief. But if I go back the only, I mean, one of the sectors where we know we have big export controls, going back to the original idea of the paper, is obviously semiconductors, where, you know, we are in a trilateral cooperation with Japan and the US on the particular case of lithography. But the interesting thing here is that you see that that's where, the distance or the spillover is shorter for Europe from the US. I mean, China actually takes longer, and that could be related to export control. So I just wanted to highlight that. And also I wanted to highlight what you just said, but on a very, because again, Europe is more on basic research, which is the concept, the general concept of artificial intelligence within artificial intelligence. There you can see that China is speaking from Europe. So in a way, I mean, okay, first, we don't lead in many of these things, but if there is a sector where we lead, China tends to pick a lot from Europe, actually shorter spillover than from the US. I think that's a very interesting finding as well. So I move swiftly to the conclusions, the implications, and they're very brief because this is, again, work in progress, so we need your help for this. So yes, I mean, after what Reinhilde showed, there's no doubt that China is innovating very quickly, but we wanted to add some dimension of true novelty in emerging technologies to come up with things such as rapid divergence, which is what you saw in the AI field for the US versus China. I mean, there is a number of those very crucial emerging technologies where the US, when you actually look at the novelty, seems to be diverging from China. And that's by all means the case of AI, the most obvious one, not semiconductors. Maybe that's what people would think. It's actually AI. I think from the EU's perspective, I think understanding why, for example, we're falling behind without as many export controls on many sectors when it comes to spillovers is a very important issue. I mean, why are we so slow in a way in replicating these patterns? A lot of what we said before I move on is, of course, subject to a lot of issues, starting with many things do not get patented. And, you know, we're only focusing on patents. Then we have, of course, European patenting, which were not included because we had an issue with including local patents because China has so many local patents. And to make a long story short, we're not saying what we find is the final word, but we do think that it's interesting to see why Europe is so slow in that replication. And I think again, the diversity in the spillover is very interesting. In some it's very, very short, and in some it's very, very long. And we don't know whether this is because of the technology, because the pattern is very hard to replicate, or because of other policy reasons. We can't separate the two. So I'm not going to replicate what we've done because I want to leave the floor to Tim. I think all of this has been clear, and I hope we get a lot of comments from your side. Tim, the floor is yours. Oh, I should have had that. Yes.
Okay.
Here you go.
Yeah, I don't know whether does it work yet?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, well, thanks so much for inviting me, and sorry for being slightly late. Maybe a disclaimer before. I'm making that mistake time and again. Whenever Alicia asks me to comment on something, I have to say the same thing. I mean, I'm an anthropologist by training who turned a public official, which is also why I have to make the disclaimer that I'm not speaking on behalf of the European Commission. But what I really want to say is I'm always expecting too thought-provocative papers to say no, commenting even. I'm never convinced that I'm the right person to comment. I'll do my very best. I was not disappointed this time as always. I think this is a fascinating paper. I make a few comments or pose a few questions at you, but then also I think I'm maybe take 2-3 minutes to situate it also a bit into qualitative research on China's innovation and policy implications, if you allow. So I mean, what is, of course, the fact that you look at novelty, I think, is extremely interesting, and also the way you're doing it. And I mean, plenty of what you presented in your presentation, I think, is knowledge that we haven't had before. So I think it's a terrific contribution to that. Nonetheless, sort of, my question to you is sort of, how do you assess the link between novelty and relevance? Because something could be novel, and it's not going to be picked up because no one cares, because it's not important. But at the same time, and I think you put that into the right context, of course, if you don't assess novelty and you just replicate the citation, then you have the problems that you described. I don't need to repeat them. So, I mean, I don't have a solution for you here, but it is sort of still a question, and also a question to what extent different methods can be combined or not. Now, I do sort of see also the tensions, because if something is really new and novel, it is also quite clear that for good reasons it may have not been cross-sighted. So I don't have the solution here, but I'm asking that myself. I think policy-wise, I think you put it into a very interesting context, and the right context here for the European Commission and the European Union more broadly, sort of as we think about export controls. I think you could broaden that even further. I mean, questions of research security, where is it worth? Where is it promising? Questions of inbound and frankly possibly also outbound investment screening. Don't need to repeat the position of the EU on this at the moment, that we are looking into this and open-ended, so there's no decision whether there will be an outbound investment instrument or not. But when considering its potential effectiveness, I think this is extremely valuable data. So on that side, I think it is extremely helpful in terms of these instruments. But frankly also, and Alicia, you probably also already expecting me this to say, I think it's not just on the defensive side of things. It's also on the question sort of where is there potential to develop technological indispensability for us. And this is an argument that we have been discussing a bit, but I think it is not so widespread. So let me sort of say 2 sentences about this. I guess one of the reasons you invited me is of the work that I'm doing in the context of a research consortium that's called Digital Power China, where half of us are China watchers, the other half are engineers, computer scientists. So we try to combine technical with country-specific China expertise. And we have published a report that does not just look into sort of the risks and how we reduce strategic dependencies that we have on China, but also look into sort of, could we remain technologically indispensable? So where do the Chinese need us at the moment technologically, and what are policies that we could put in place to keep the Chinese reliant on us? And I think in that context, this is also extremely valuable data to sort of see from the perspective of novelty in patterns. Where are we actually leading? And then I think it needs sort of as a second step a qualitative exploration, both what do the Chinese do, but also sort of qualitative from a technological viewpoint, sort of what is in there, what is the relevance, how could we assess sort of that quantitative data. So I think that is extremely valuable, but that is sort of more sort of a comment on, you could highlight the relevance is even broader. You're underselling, I think, at the moment your results a bit. So that was on that. Maybe then on a final point, sort of say a few words sort of context, as I promised. I mean, I think it is extremely interesting to sort of take a step back and sort of remind ourselves how we have seen the Chinese only a few years ago, 10 years ago certainly, but maybe even less, where most of us have expected China to be more or less a copycat, mimicking, catching up, but sort of where the innovation capacity that I think you measure rightly and sort of put into perspective to what extent it is an innovation powerhouse or not. But China has become innovative. I mean, certainly if we compare with Europe, as we can see from the charts, but even if we compare with the United States, it's not that the Chinese are marginal and don't matter at all, even if the US is still leading. And I think we have, and I think that's a point where we Europeans need to ask ourselves, what have we missed? How have the Chinese become so innovative? And I think there's, apart from, of course, mimicking and IP theft that has been focused on, I think, of course, that has played a role. I don't want to deny that. What I want to say, though, is that would only help catching up. This is not enough to innovate. And I think there's 5 sort of ingredients, if you like, that have made the Chinese innovative. The first to me is the scale of market and the scaling of protectionism. So, of course, if China had been a smaller market, a less attractive opportunity for outside actors, I think it would have had a much harder time to become as innovative as it is today, especially if you combine it with China's scaling of protectionism. And what do I mean by scaling of protectionism? I think take the Great Firewall as sort of a non-traditional form of protectionism. I mean, do we really think the Chinese have been incapable over over so many years that the Great Firewall is in place, that they could have not closed more of the existing loopholes? I don't think so. I think it's on purpose that you can always scale up and down the access to the market. It is not just a matter of information control. It is also a matter of that I want innovation ideas to get into the country. At the same time, I want to protect infant industries. So I can't. So I'm not rigid in sort of completely closing a market segment, but I'm always sort of able to scale up and down. I think there's plenty of these examples in China. The second ingredient for me is the attraction of technology into the country. I mean, just look at data on the return of talent to China and how attractive China got for talent that was educated abroad. But of course also, forced technology transfer. I'm not necessarily like the word forced here in some cases. Yes, but of course, say, the conditioning of market access and thereby sort of a choice, do I want to miss this opportunity? If not, then I have to transfer respective technologies to China. The third element for me is liaising with the West. I mean, we have been importing plenty of technology. Interestingly, when we put export controls in place, I think that's the point where we realize that Chinese companies, despite the attempts to become more self-reliant, have continued importing Western technologies. It is about acquisitions. I mean, I don't have to explain that. I think we have been discussing that in the context of FDI screening a long time. And of course, the research collaborations that come into the picture now more with questions of research security. The fourth ingredient to me is party state guidance. I mean, the role of the party state, we have tended to see this rather as a hampering factor because we always felt that the free market is doing the best of it all and the state doesn't know where to put resources and how to steer innovation. But 5-year plans are not that kind of state control anymore. This is more sort of a signaling of political priorities, of strategic priorities, that trickle then down to lower ranks of the party state, that trickle down to financial institutions where to allocate resources. And in a way, it is also socializing risk by sort of signaling a political preference for certain fields without getting so detailed as to prescribe where precisely innovation should happen, where manufacturing should happen. So I think that form of guidance and socializing of risk, I think, is very important as well. And fifth and finally, the Chinese way of competition. I mean, we see innovation-savvy society. I think Chinese have made, other than Europeans certainly, but Americans as well, the experience that change has benefited them enormously over the last few decades, and I think this has made them very eager and very willing to pick up new innovation. Of course, that has happened in a highly competitive and competition-oriented environment. I think there's rather sort of competition between different political, economic complexes, so even with the party involved there, then that there is no competition. Now, what does that sort of imply for the paper or for the relevance of your paper? And I close with that. I think what we have to understand in this context now is that these elements, even though they're all still in place, I think it's not a given how innovative China is going to remain in the next decade. I mean, if you go through, and I'm not having the time to go through it one by one now, but I think both the domestic conditions domestic conditions in all these 5 fields that sort of change. The tendency of a closing market, the tendency of a securitization of the market, a tendency of the centralization of scarcer resources. So all this does not play into the advantage of China's innovativeness, but I don't think we can either be mistaken and sort of say this Chinese innovation model is going to die out. That's not what I'm saying, but I think China is facing an uphill battle. And here is sort of the point that I really want to make in relation to your paper. I think what we also see, I think if we carefully go through, the EU may not be sort of determining China's innovativeness, but if you go through, if I'm correct with my analysis with these 5 ingredients that made China innovative, it is also clear that China still relies to a certain extent on European input. And so whether we get diversification and de-risking right, whether we got export and investment guarantees right, whether we get FDI screening, export controls, research security, anti-dumping, etc., all these measures right or wrong, and how we calibrate them, I think will have not the defining impact on China's innovativeness, but it is one of several factors in there. And I think that does provide leverage to the EU, and for that kind of thinking, I think granular data of the kind that you deliver, I think is really helpful and really can really be very impactful for EU policymaking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. This was a very elaborate discussion here with very good points. I'd like to very briefly summarize these points and then take it back to the panel. But actually, we also want to make sure that you have time for Q&As, both here in person as well as the ones which are following virtually here. So in the meantime, while we are having this first reaction here, please, for the ones that are following virtually, put your questions on Slido with /China hashtag to use here, and we'll be checking these questions also here. So just to summarize the main points here so that make sure we get also relevant replies to that. So first point is novelty is a very important concept here, but the question is to which extent does it also translate into valuable patents here? We know that novelty also has a lot of risk here. Some may not work out, others may do here. And so to which extent do we really have the novelty that creates the next breakthroughs, on which we're always talking about? Second point was the effect of the export controls and what effect it would actually have. That's one policy instrument, but could also be interesting to look at what other policy environments would influence creation of novelty and the diffusion of novelty here. Third point was more not only looking at the impact of novelty and the diffusion, but also more from a proactive perspective here, in the sense that how much can Europe also benefit from novelty of others here. And that may be very important also in the whole light of technology sovereignty. If that's what we really want to establish within these fields, it's not just only how much can we protect ourselves from being misused by others here or stolen, but also how much of our novel patents, breakthrough novel patents, also rely on inputs from US and China here, because otherwise closing down may also restrict these positive spillovers that we actually would need here. So I think those were, and then of course the question of what can we learn from the Chinese innovation system in order to generate more these breakthrough type of innovations here, the importance of local markets and stuff like that. So I think these are already very important questions. That's why I definitely want to make sure that there is also a reply to these comments here before we go to the floor. But in the meantime, prepare your questions and on Slido, and while we have the first round of reactions, you can prepare your questions well. So, can I give the floor to you, Alicia?
Yeah, it's okay now. I'll be literally 1 minute because I think we can take questions and then maybe Robin and Mikael can answer, other questions which might also be more technical. But I just want to say that, Tim, you gave us the answer to Reinhilde's point of what can we learn from China, we Europeans, after what we saw. And I think you said it all. Scale of the market. I mean, this is essential. Scale of protectionism. This we're starting to learn. It seems, we just heard that we're starting to learn this, which we had forgotten because we were in a different paradigm. But we're changing our paradigm for better or worse. But we are moving in this direction. For the scale of the market, I think, we can hear later from DigiGrowth, but I think it's very important. Attraction of technology. I think here we still have a lot to learn, looking at the spillovers, yeah? I mean, how can it be that with all of the research collaboration with the US, we have longer spillovers than China? It sounds like strange, but we're there. And I think finally, return of talent. Another key issue, I think, if we go through why we're here, I think a lot of these things have been missing in a way, and they are very, very important. I think one thing, I finish here, indispensability, your concept, your wonderful paper. I hope everybody can read Tim's made, the editor, but it's a lot of people, as he explained. And I think what I really liked about your second paper is about the idea of reverse indispensability, European indispensability towards China, rather than only China's indispensability. What these graphs show is that, because if you think about indispensability as radical novelty, something that nobody can replicate. Of course, you define it very differently. You have to have, nearly a monopoly, or, in the case of ASML, blah, blah, blah. But I'm just saying, imagine a new indispensability, an embryonic indispensability, like something out of these novelties that Mikael showed, only partially because there's many more. The problem is that we hardly have any. And I have to say, China has much fewer than the US. I'm not talking about the average. I'm talking about the fields. You remember the fields where the bars where we show China versus the US? It's really, the indispensability remains in these emerging technologies in the US, which in a way brings me to the final point, which is, can we do what the US does in terms of our economic security? If we don't have these indispensabilities in these novelties, can we replicate that? Or should we focus on, instead of, as you said, protection, sorry to say, attack, meaning reducing our gap in the spillovers? Shouldn't we change towards a more aggressive approach China-wise? With the 4 points you mentioned, meaning capturing rather than protecting, or maybe also, but we don't have much to protect. This is what the paper is showing in these emerging technologies. So I just wanted to, hopefully, on the policy front, bring this idea that maybe the key point here is, what about reducing spillovers reducing the time of the spillovers with the US? Being able to reduce the gap rather than focus only on becoming indispensable if we are not really at this point in time. So that was just the policy conclusion I wanted to add, and I think we can all.
Yeah, okay. I think it's really, we have already ask for a lot of patience on your side here. So I would like to first give the floor to the people here in the room before turning to some of the Slido questions. So if you just raise your hand, there are walking mics here, and you can, yeah.
When we take your research on the state level, you talk about China, EU, or speak over, but can we just pay some attention to the business level or NC level? So for your case about the EV, if we take a look about the EU markets, China's auto, there's most of this cars, EV autos are exported to the EU market actually belong to the UK, like Shanghai's MG, like other, like belong to the MNGs. If we talk MNCs, this, if we take a business level, for this spillover, all the China's innovation just mostly come from the multinational corporations, global supply chain. Do we see global all the such kind of this spillover project effect, not just China's totally owned individuals innovation or follow up or copy. Actually, we can also by such kind of globalization, this MNC's business, and we can find even the use like Snyder, the UK's MG enjoy the such kind of benefits. And also when we talk about the innovation, we should care about only Chinese market, the huge demand side. You talk about so many supply side, but from demand side, only China has such kind of capacity to reduce the cost, reduce the price of the such kind of innovation in the shortest time. So that's my suggestions. First is the MNC's level, second is the demand side. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. A good point in terms of who are these innovation actors, the multinationally operating, and what effect that would have on the. Yeah, I'm collecting still a bit of questions before we turn back the floor. Anybody else here? Otherwise, we will also take some of the ones that are on Slido here, so you have time to think about those here. I think very important question is also on what the role of the EU policy should be here in terms of also this scaled up protectionism or nationalism. Is it something that will hinder our technology sovereignty and our innovation here, or would allow us to make us stronger in terms of technological sovereignty here? I think that's important. The scaling up in terms of not only markets but also access to finance, always usually an issue raised here. And then what do we ask from our knowledge institutions in the EU here who can also be behind some of these breakthrough novel technologies here? Should we actually stop the collaboration with China here as a way of trying to build up the technological sovereignty here? So I think all very important questions in terms of policy relevance of these results here. So you'll have some time to think about it, unless there are no questions here from the floor. Yeah, and there. Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, my name is June Park. I'm a South Korean political economist, currently working in Doha, Qatar. I came here not just for this, but for several things. I very much enjoyed the presentation, and I think that the methodology is very unique. The only concern that I have is about cross-listing of patents across jurisdictions, and it may be kind of related to the comment previously on multinationals trying to register. Just noting from the Korean case, usually what happens is when you have a novelty, you register first of all at the USPTO, no matter what, in order to prevent patent trolls attacking Samsung or LG Electronics in Korea. And then you register in the EU and then your own jurisdiction also in China. And I think that one of the panelists also noted that the local patent, the number of local patents are extremely big in China. So I wonder whether you were able to sort of decide on how to go about this issue while you were counting them. And then the other issue, other question that I had was, I may not have. It's still related to the patents. So the quality and the quantity of these novelties, how would you define them? And maybe my question is a little bit too broad. How would you? So would you be interested in looking into patent dispute cases? Because that would really prove where the cutting edge technology conflict is. But I don't know how to calculate this, so I'll leave it to you.
Yeah. So 2 questions on this concept of novelty here. On the one hand, to which extent does the US advantage maybe be related to the fact that the US market is the most important one to protect yourselves in, and that might give an advantage to US companies? And the other question was more in terms of the novelty concept itself, the extent to which that could actually, so when does it really show novelty, and when could it actually be also more proven in terms of the impact of that novelty on the, and I think also related to a bit to the previous question in terms of, would also be interesting to look at who is actually introducing these novelty patents here. Would that be smaller startup companies? Would that be the established companies, the multinational corporations, the research institutes here? That would also give us a better idea of what role these novel patents actually play in driving the emergence of new avenues and technologies here. We had another question, or at least a hand raised there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus Gustafsson, DG Trade. I just wanted to, Alicia, your remark there about maybe lowering barriers to research and spillovers rather than raising barriers. I think that's a very interesting idea. Maybe this is more for like the future research that will come out of this. I thought all of this is very, very interesting, so very much looking forward to the finalized data. But in terms of the applications, suggestions of how you can do this, and also with whom, I think sometimes there is, for example, a difficulty to work with the US because they have quite a domestic focus, and as we see an emerging subsidy race, there's also a tendency to restrict that to your own market rather than wanting to collaborate. And I think those kind of policy conclusions would indeed be very interesting to see you kind of inject into the debate. Thanks.
Yep. So they would also looking at, so when Europe would actually create these novel patents, to which extent does it use also insights from other patents here? And again, also what role that the innovation actors play. So is it through multinationals or through research institutes collaborating here? Would be very interesting, yeah. We have already quite a lot of interesting questions here. So maybe we should, otherwise you cannot remember all these questions.
I
so
leave the floor to
yeah.
Robin and Mikael first for the whatever they can sort out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
How it works, I think. So I will try to answer the questions about how we build the data set, because this was one of the biggest challenges that we had at the very beginning. Should we include all the patents from local offices or not? So first of all, we analyzed the literature, which was showing that local patents in China, the big share of local patents in China are just submitted for the purposes of achieving some KPIs, some indicators in the companies. So the quality that was measured in other papers indicated that probably if we wanted to work on the novelty concepts, we shouldn't focus on the local patents from China. So based on this research, we decided not to include it. The completely different approach was for the United States, because in the United States, lots of companies, they submit the patents only locally. They don't care about the international patents. So even if we compared the quality between PCT and the local patents, indicated that we might find more relevant content for our definition of novelty in the local patents than in the international ones. So this is how we built our decision on the composition of the data set. Then secondly, an excellent point about the quality of the novelty, because it's important to distinguish if this is just a novelty, a new keyword that appeared, or this is something that had a big impact on the future research. So for that, we used, for now, let's say a control mechanism. It means that every novelty had to be repeated at least 5 times. This number comes again from another paper, another suggestion from the paper, from some arts research. However, we plan in our paper, we plan to apply other control mechanisms like the citations to check if this is correlated with the number, with the quality based on citations. And we want to also apply some other quality indicators to make sure that all the novelties that we found are important. So there are some technicalities, but we are of course aware, and we took some decisions in our methodology regarding these points. But these were excellent questions, of course.
Yeah, so I want to... Hello? Ah, yeah, no, it works. So it's important to distinguish what we are doing and what we're actually not doing. So we're checking right now, we're checking just whether China is embarking on a new technology trajectory, not whether this technology trajectory is then very, very, very impactful. And the reason why we're doing, why we're not focusing on impact is because we're using a time frame of 2019 to 2023. So it's a bit difficult so far to check if the novelties are actually repeated over time. What we thought about doing was to take an earlier period, let's say, for example, 2005 to 2018 or 19, and to check whether the impact has actually increased. So there we could use an impact indicator in order to check, in order to see whether time essentially predicts a higher degree of impact. Also, I mean, this database is once we have figured out how to, or once we have it all together, we can actually do a lot of things with it. And one thing will be to check where the research is coming from, in order to see whether it's coming from the universities, whether it's coming from small companies, from big companies, whether it's more connected to developmental research or to basic research within the universities. And also, one can check from the patents whether there's patent collaboration actually. So this is another question that we could answer with that. So the possibilities are almost infinite, but we have only so much time. Yeah, it's also important to check that we, for example, if we talk about semiconductors, one big thing is lithography machines, and one could check whether China is, for example, making progress in lithography machines. But the thing is that lithography machines might not be. I mean, the traditional way of fabricating semiconductors, but there have been research done on alternative ways, such as nano imprinting, and it would be very important to also check this. Yes, so that's it from my side, and I give the floor back to Alicia.
So I have just a few minutes and many questions that have not been addressed on the policy side of what Europe should do. Before I do that, I do think that checking on the origin of the patent is important to go to the point of not only relevance, but as you said, economic, if I may say. I mean, whether these patents are going to bring a lot to Europe. I mean, it's not only about the number, but the businesses that may be developed through those key patents. And I think for that is very important to know who is patenting. We have started that for China, looking at these 3 emerging technologies, what's the role of foreign companies? Because the other thing you can think of, again, we're thinking policy here, maybe a little bit defensive. We're not yet on the offensive because it's very hard. But on the defensive, of course, the other issue is, what if a lot of these emerging technologies patents in China, but on WIPO or USPTO, are from foreign companies localized in China? I mean, what's going to happen to that? Because that might be the next move from the US. Yeah, you just can't, because China is pushing localization, but we're not reacting yet to that. We may very soon. We may say, I'm sorry, if you localize, If you're registering patents in China, we're not going to be happy. I mean, this may come very soon. So I think knowing who is innovating in these emerging technologies is very important to know whether this is the next thing coming on the protective side, or also what does it mean for this company. So a lot of that. We've not done it yet for a very simple reason. Our methodology does not allow for, which is what Philip Boyne has just done on a paper, is using any type of registry of innovation, because we are deciding on the fields. We're not taking the fields from existing. So basically, June, to your point, it's not easy for us to do that, because we cannot, I mean, we can of course find, but it takes a long time in our methodology to do that. We don't have the registry. I mean, for those who are in the literature, they probably understand what I'm talking about. Now, policy very quickly. Should we work still, first question is a bit, because, this is an open event, should we still collaborate? And, well, I'm nobody to decide on this. But I do think it is about time to know more about the benefits versus the cost of collaboration. There is a paper that, for some reason, I don't think we included this time, but we've used in the past. It's a paper for Switzerland, collaboration between Swiss researchers and Chinese researchers. And there's a lot of findings there. One is that 2/3 of the main co-authors, so the corresponding author, are Chinese in those collaboration. And what that means for for your rankings is obvious. Why is this the case? The paper doesn't really go in depth, but that would be a very nice research project. Is there a bias in basically in the citations that we're finding because of basically power of collaboration or leveraging on collaboration? So there's many things. I think before we even answer that question, we need to know to see whether this makes sense or doesn't make sense. And I think the others are very easy. Is EU nationalism hindering innovation? Of course. EU lacks sufficient venture capital? Of course. So, I mean, there's a lot to work.
But we still have the afternoon.
That, right?
And in the afternoon, we will be discussing, indeed, industrial policy here, so we should not anticipate too much. This, and also, it's 12 o'clock, so it's time for our keynote before we have lunch. We're very happy here to have George Magnus, who is a research associate at the China Center from the University of Oxford here, who will give us his thoughts that we can really digest during lunch here and then discuss all the policy implications after lunch here. So, George, can I give you the floor? Can you...
Can I use a head mic? Is that possible?
Yes, but I don't know how to get that onto you. So can we have some support here if you... So can you? No, but he likes to have them. Yeah, it has to be installed. Right. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And thank you to Bruegel for inviting me here today, and very good morning. So I'm going to sort of take you out of the laboratory into the boxing ring, and talk to you a little bit about the kind of the Venn bit of the diagram where innovation and politics and economics get dirty, so to speak. So I've got quite a lot to say. I've got notes to keep me in check, and I'll try and keep an eye on the time to make sure I am honest to it. Oh no, it's okay. I'm good to stand. It's fine. Are you all right? So I'm not going to spend too much time, or indeed any time, really talking about some of the issues which the Chinese economy has at the moment. And I think you are probably very familiar with many of these, misallocation of capital, debt, property, stalling productivity, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not like Xi Jinping has been short of advice about what to do about it. So all over the world, economists and think tanks have been telling him, you basically need to boost consumption, you need to boost domestic demand, you have to kind of abandon hukou system, you have to do all sorts of things. And actually there have been many Chinese economists in think tanks and universities in the mainland that have actually come to broadly similar conclusions in some respects. But I think it's probably fair to say that when we kind of consider about how the government has decided, or what are they going to do about this kind of hiatus in the China's economy, that the decision has been effectively made that they're not going to go that route. And as you know, one of the most kind of popularly or frequently recited phrases in government rhetoric now is the phrase new productive forces. New productive forces are nothing if not about the cutting edge of science and technology which underlies the discussion that you've just heard. So it was first mentioned by Xi Jinping in September of last year, and it made pretty frequent and trenchant appearances in the Central Economic Work Conference that takes place every December, at the National People's Congress earlier this year. And in fact, a few months ago, Xi Jinping said to the Political Bureau of the Central Committee, quote, "Developing new productive forces is an intrinsic requirement and an important focus of promoting high-quality development, and innovation will play a leading role." We're going to hear a lot more about this next month when the long-delayed but much anticipated third plenum takes place, since I expect that this will be the kernel of, there'll be lots of things which will be discussed to be sure, but I think this will occupy center stage. And it's really important to understand what is meant by new productive forces and how this fits into the CCP's strategy for China, both in terms of domestic consequences, like is this going to work, and also internationally, because as you know, trade frictions are already accelerating and are likely to continue, I suspect, to do so. So the first thing is, new productive forces really are about industrial policy and fit into a campaign that really picked up steam in the 2000s, the mid-2000s. Before that, China didn't really have industrial policy in the way that we have subsequently come to understand it. So there have basically been three phases of industrial policy. The first was from 2006 to 2012. So the focus at this time was on economic development strategy, on sectors. There were 20 strategic emerging industries were identified. They've subsequently been consolidated and whittled down to 9. And of course, you all know and probably familiar with the phrase indigenous innovation, which basically was born really in this period. The second phase dates from 2013, so that's really just after Xi Jinping came to power. From 2013 to 2019, the focus still obviously on economic development, but also on holistic approach to national security, not in the way that it has done subsequently, but in its but was relevant in its time. This was really about capacity expansion on technology revolution. Here we see the introduction of Made in China 2025, the Internet Plan, the launch of industrial guidance funds. These are these huge or rather large number of funds at central government and local and provincial government levels that actually allocate large amounts of capital to Chinese industries. Innovation development strategy started around this time, along with important papers on AI, smart solar, and military civic fusion. And then from 2020 onwards, really we have another phase of industrial policy that really is all about, and overwhelmingly about, national security and about power. The strategy is really about self-sufficiency, self-empowerment, self-reliance, you can pick your own phrase, but also about the introduction of national science and technology plans and funding, which also extend to dual circulation strategy, which you may remember, and most recently the digital China strategy. So new productive forces in the Chinese economy are significant, but they're not quite as big as real estate, in fact not by a long chalk. And they're not as big as, if you look at retailing, wholesaling and distribution, that's also sort of comparable size or a little bit bigger. If you look at leasing and finance, for example, that's about the same size as the whole concept of strategic emerging industries. So if you looked at that more broadly defined list of industries, which goes beyond those cutting-edge science and tech sectors, the strategic industries account for about 13.5% of GDP, which is pretty much double what it was in 2014. And the government's ambition really is to grow this to about 17.5% next year. The Economist magazine recently estimated that annual investment in strategic industries amounts to about $1.6 trillion, or about 20% of total capex. So quite a lot of money going into a very important sector. The actual numbers in terms of new productive forces, or those industries covered by NPFs, is probably a bit smaller. They include some sort of older productive forces. There's a bit of double counting in there as well, but it's significant. And what's important, I think, are a couple of things really about this. I mean, of course, just like in the United States, you know, the big tech companies are never going to, they dominate the tech sector, they dominate global technology, they'll never account for the lion's share of America's GDP, and these industries in China will never account for the lion's share of China's economy. But what's important really is whether the institutions exist for these higher productivity parts of the economy to bring the boring bits of the economy that you very rarely read about to life. So if you look at retailing, wholesaling, transportation and so on, business services, these are the areas that have to catch on to the innovations that are going on in the tech sector. The other thing that's really important is whether, as Barry Norton, who's a sort of grandfather of Chinese economy and industry strategy is concerned, he's called the greatest single commitment of government resources to industrial policy in history. It's quite some claim, but if Norton makes it, I think you have to take it pretty seriously. So obviously, a lot of the industrial policy spending is going to end up with successful enterprises, exports, and business entities. We all know who they are at the moment, mostly. But a lot of it is likely to end up in waste and loss as well, especially if there is a stigma, a political stigma, about acknowledging failure, about lack of transparency, about local governments, non-listed enterprises, preferential treatment mechanisms, and indirect subsidy schemes, all of which there's a bit of a cloud over, and which there is a bit of a cloak around, actually, which means that we can't really evaluate some of these things directly and properly. But if you look at a kind of a whole range of support measures, and you heard the panelists before talk about this, you did, and certainly. If you look at, for example, direct industry policy subsidies, tax credits and incentives, below market borrowing, right? So these will be equity and fixed income capital raising exercises which are effectively underwritten by the state. R&D funding, subsidized credit, spending by the government guidance funds, discounted land sales, tax incentives, you know, a whole gamut of initiatives. These amount, according to CSIS in Washington in 2019, at about 1.7% of GDP annually. So the OECD reckons that we, in the rest of the kind of developed market economies, spend between 0.3 and 0.7% of GDP annually, depending on countries. Obviously, some countries spend a bit more than others. Obviously, this is now 4 years ago, so by 2023, 2024, you'd imagine that these sums are bigger, certainly will be in the US case because of the Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS and science and so on and so forth, but also in China. And also, I suppose, take Barry Norton's kind of point, really, if you think about the faltering of tax revenues in China, so this is a really serious issue. Because of faltering land sales, local governments are starved of revenues. You know, only about 4% of Chinese people pay income tax. You know, so there's a very regressive tax system in China. The economy is much weaker. Nominal GDP is very soft. So the claims on faltering tax revenues aren't just coming from industrial policy, but also from local governments, the need for military spending, the need for internal security, spending on an aging society, you know, blah, blah, blah. So there's quite a lot of pressure on budgets from that point of view. Brief word about context, okay? So we all want to be top dog in science and technology, and you've heard from Alicia and Robin and colleagues about, you know, where the EU is kind of lagging behind and where it needs to make amends and so on and so forth. But for China, I think the issue is not just about being top dog in science and technology, and I think this is a really important point for policymakers to understand. For the government of China, this is an important historical moment to, in a narrative about transforming not just its own economy, but also taking the political or geopolitical opportunity to lead and dominate what Xi Jinping has called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This narrative, as you may know, is driven by a very strong Leninist sense of the role that turbulence plays in history. Xi Jinping talks a lot about great changes unseen in a century, and what he means by that really is a moment in which the contradictions between emerging technologies on the one hand and the existing economic order on the other lead to structural changes that Marxists term changes in production relations in societies in which the old order ends up being overturned. And so I think that's the kind of context in which we should see the role that the current iteration of industrial policy and new productive forces is being implemented. It does have a geopolitical purpose. The purpose is for China to lead and to dominate the Fourth Industrial Revolution and thereby to end America's role or leadership in the global system. I mean, that sounds very dramatic, and we should probably have a philosophy class about that, but that's essentially what I think it's all about, at least from an ideological point of view. So new productive forces in this sense is a very old Marxist concept, but it's framed in a very new and modern Chinese way as an important theoretical basis for governance and for industrial and trade policy. So if you think about it from this point of view, the opportunities, you know, I mean, we talk a lot and have spoken a lot in years gone by about, you know, the spats with Japan in the 1980s and the 1990s, and about, you know, disputes that are, you know, brought to the WTO, and, you know, the EU and the US, of course, have their own arguments about tariffs and trade and so on and so forth. But the opportunities for collaboration and compromise must be bigger here, because they're really about individual policies that lack this very, very important geopolitical context. So what I think is the context in which to frame this really is really whether this new industrial kind of strategy or additional industrial strategy is going to succeed in substituting for the bad bits of the economy that actually have run out of steam or juice. So this is, now we're talking about a country, you know, we spoke before about China being a very big country, that it can scale things up. China already accounts for about a third of global manufacturing value added, and of course is the heart of the world's supply chains. So there's no question at all about whether China has industrial capacity. It has it galore, and obviously applies it with great efficiency in many ways. But I suppose the point I want to make is that production and manufacturing prowess alone are only really part of the story. China's track record, for example, when it comes to design, standards, branding, profitability, commercialization, is improving dramatically in some areas, but at least it's not in the same kind of league, really, as its manufacturing prowess. Obviously, the politics in China make a difference, governance makes a difference, institutions make a difference, and industrial policy and innovation are often conflated in a way which I think is not helpful to understanding the implications for policy and outcomes. So I think the way I would try to distinguish it is industrial policy is really a kind of a vertical concept, right? Which is where the government seeks to create national champions to dominate specific areas, and industries are designated to target output, market share, products in specific firms and sectors and so on. And this China does a lot, and is essentially what I think New Productive Forces is really all about. Innovation I see really as a rather different sort of concept. It's a much more horizontal concept in which the government endeavors to create stronger and more inclusive institutions. They focus on things like competition policy, regulatory policy, education policy, skill formation, infrastructure, tax, labor policies. All of these things are designed to improve the efficiency and productivity of the whole economy, including the boring bits of the economy, not just those designated sectors that are supposed to take you to a kind of a new nirvana. So in this context, the government is a facilitator, it's an enabler, whereas with industrial policy as more formally defined, the government takes on a much more specific leading role, which is indistinguishable from its role in propagating trade policy and exports in what we might otherwise call mercantilism. And that's really what kind of China does, and I think this is the difficulty that Europe and the United States and several other countries are having to find a way of adapting to this or trying to accommodate or counter it. So I just want to say a few words about innovation. So many of you may be familiar with the paper that Alicia and Robin wrote last year, I think, called China's Quest for Innovation, Progress and Bottlenecks. I'm not going to kind of go over the excellent points that they made in that paper. I'd like to make or offer a couple of additional remarks and perspectives that hopefully gel a little bit with what you heard in the panel. So you heard reference before to the World Intellectual Property Organization's report. Comes out every year, Global Innovation Index. It's based on 80 different measurements, and it ranks 132 countries. So in the 2023 report, as you already heard, China ranked 12th, which is a position it's held with very, very minor variations ever since it entered the index in 2014. And it's the only middle-income country to actually have such an elevated ranking. But if you look at the disaggregated details of that index, you will find that China ranks 8th in terms of what they call innovation outputs, which is things like patent registration, high-tech manufacturing, intellectual property, and things like trademarks, media and entertainment, online creative sectors. So 8th in innovation outputs, but 25th in terms of innovation inputs, like competition, legal and regulatory institutions, different types of information and communications infrastructure, business and market sophistication, and human capital and research. Now, there's big difference in these two kind of rankings. You know, one is kind of almost world-class, one is, you know, kind of runners-up, really, but quite a long way behind. And it's a noteworthy difference because in the medium to longer term, you'd think that the inputs actually have to determine the outputs. And that distinction, I think, is really quite important as we look to the future. Now, as the Robin and Alicia's paper makes clear, China has been catching up in terms of R&D spending, now about 2.5% of GDP, well, I say now, it was about 2.5% of GDP in 2022, according to the OECD. So it's certainly on a par with some European countries, not quite up there with the United States and one or two others. But in human capital formation, for example, there's a really interesting kind of point to make, which is based on, I don't know whether you read it, it came out, I think, last year or the year before, as a wonderful book by Scott Rozelle and Natalie Hell called Invisible China, which drew attention to the very poor level of educational attainment in China's workforce. So the census that they built their numbers on was, I think, in 2010. Obviously, that's now almost an eternity ago, and so we've had a census that's been done since then, which does clearly show improvement because the government's attention and focus has been to get more people through into university, tertiary education, apprenticeships and skills and so on and so forth. So it's a generational thing which is almost bound to improve over time, right? But it's a very, very long-lasting, it takes a long time to actually get results. But Rozelle and Hell's findings, really, were that only 15% of the workforce had secondary school qualifications or better, and only 30% of people had secondary school education or better, and only 15% of the workforce had university degrees or tertiary qualifications or better. This is quite low, obviously, when you compare it not just with developed market economies, but also with emerging market peer groups like Mexico, for example, or Brazil, but also with Asian tiger economies when they had very similar income per capita to China many, many years ago. So this is a really, so what you see in Shanghai and Beijing and obviously many of the big cities in terms of school output is one thing and creditable for what it is, but it doesn't really reflect the national kind of average, as it were, and makes you wonder really just how well equipped China's workforce is yet, at least at this point in time, for an innovation economy. There's also issues about, I mean, you've heard a lot about patent registration, so I'm not going to go into that in great detail, except to say that obviously some of the caveats about it are that less than 10% of Chinese patents are filed and granted abroad, which may say something about the value that is placed upon them internationally as opposed to domestically. And some of you may also be familiar with a study that came out in February of this year by Yuan Ang and a number of other researchers who studied 4.6 million patents filed over a kind of a 20-year period in 330 mainland cities. And they discovered a very high level of gaming of top-down patent targets, wasteful subsidies, and what they call chronic duplication and plagiarism. So not everything you see is what you get in the kind of headline numbers. So they do have to be scrutinized very carefully, which is obviously what the purpose of this seminar has been to tell you and teach you about. So we're almost getting to the end now. China's innovation performance also, I think, has to be considered in the context of what are still very, very highly uncertain macroeconomic circumstances, which include overinvestment and inefficiency, difficulties in reversing the flow of jobs out of manufacturing and construction into gig economy jobs, low-skilled jobs, income inequality, job malaise and insecurity, the neglect of the consumption sector, the not so favorable conditions that private firms and entrepreneurs find themselves in because of the governance shift and legal and regulatory shift that's taking place in the country. And as you know, studies by the EU Chamber of Commerce and AmCham and others in China have found that a significant minority, so between 20-25% of countries, of firms in China with mainland presence are either have done or are considering putting future investment, hedging their bets basically, by placing future investments outside of China into countries like Mexico, Vietnam, India, Thailand, amongst the four favorite places. But a lot of this also includes Chinese companies. If you look at what's going on in Mexico, which is now America's biggest trading partner, I mean, it's surpassed China in terms of share of imports. I mean, a lot of the companies that are exporting into the United States from Mexico are Chinese, not just friend-shored or reshored. So the last thing I just wanted to say a few words about were the consequences of all of this for this kind of sensitive area of overcapacity. Because obviously it's a big issue if, as a lot of us suspect, that actually what China's effectively is doing, its model, is effectively externalizing its domestic problems by forcing other countries to run bigger trade deficits. And that includes the US and, of course, the EU. And that disquiet is also not confined to the EU and to the United States. So in the last month, for example, Japan, India, Brazil, and Turkey have all announced trade tariffs or restrictions against China, or announced anti-dumping measures, anti-dumping investigations in specific sectors like aluminum and steel, or in Turkey's case, and Brazil's, I think, electric vehicles. I'm not sure myself that the case of overcapacity in electric vehicles is proven, actually. It's probably one area that is big question mark over. But obviously politically, politicians have kind of taken up the mantle and believe it is. But certainly, China manufactures 80% of the world's solar panels, most of the capital equipment needed to manufacture them. It outproduces everyone in terms of wind turbines and all the components that go into making them. And there are long-standing concerns about overproduction in steel, shipbuilding, industrial machinery and materials such as glass and cement, railway and highway infrastructure, internal combustion engine vehicles and batteries. And that's before you consider a lot of the kind of contentious issues nowadays about national security issues which are implicit in data systems and in cellular modules and the Internet of Things, which is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Certainly hearings in the Congress are testify to that. So it's sensitive areas which I think are only likely to grow in significance. And I suppose my last point really is to draw a very kind of loose but poignant, I think, parallel with Japan of 40, 45 years ago. So if you look back at, because we had lots of trade disputes with Japan, obviously, as you remember, and there was a time, certainly during the 1980s, where everybody thought Japan was going to take over the world. And in fact, there are some wonderful quotes by American academics and policymakers, which really are almost kind of capitulative in terms of their sentiment about we just can't compete with the Japanese. And of course, the Japanese had world-class companies that were doing world-class technology, and yet, right? And yet, these world-class companies could not save Japan from what happened in 1990 and for the following decades. So if you fast forward to 2024, you know, we all know about Alibaba and Tencent and Huawei and BYD and CATL and so on. And you have very, very high levels of achievement, world-class leadership in key technological areas. But you also have these things that live alongside deep economic imbalances, systemic economic imbalances, asset prices that can't adjust properly, political contradictions and institutional rigidities which are really problematic for the government to try to resolve. And what it basically says is that having strong and good firms, even if you do have them, and top-down industrial policy, they don't protect you against an economy that has poor or weak macroeconomic policies and outcomes. So what you really need, of course, is a well-wired technological ecosystem in which success is recognized, failure is recognized, embarrassment is recognized, but which encourages a kind of a learning process in which the technology and the innovation can really kind of spread throughout the economy and not become restricted to a relatively narrow range of sectors. So the short answer to, actually I'm not sure whether my title was something about whether innovation could substitute for structural deceleration in China, which I probably should have mentioned at the beginning. And the answer is no, I don't think it can. I think you have to really address the causes of structural deceleration. Enjoy the innovation and obviously make big capital out of it, but you have to look at both. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Yeah.
So I think it would be a bit dangerous to actually start a Q&A with no minutes left here. So I propose that actually we use the time we have, the 45 minutes for lunch. You will be...
yeah, I'll be here.
The target of many questions. But thanks, you make a very good point of really trying to balance the strengths and the weaknesses, the threats and the opportunities of China and what this implies for Europe here. So what you actually very clearly identify is that we need to continue the discussion of this over lunch and after lunch here. So we brought a lot of elements here and how it's a point of balancing each of these and what this would mean in the end to where we could land. Thanks a lot for the keynote, and let's enjoy lunch here next door, 45 minutes, and then we will be back. Thank you. Still shining in Belgium, very exceptional. But I hope this morning we already showed you the value of staying here inside, indoors, and also that you had a good opportunity for informal conversations over lunch here, but now we're going to continue the discussion on something which I'm sure you'll also be very interested in terms of what's the implications for how we should design our industrial policy, learning more about how China does industrial policy and what this implies as a challenge, opportunity for Europe here. So we will start with David. I'm supposing.
Start with the paper, sorry.
All right. Change to the. Okay, so Alicia, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Yes. So thank you. So we're here now with. I'm not sure you can put up with the many slides we need to show you after the ones you already saw this morning. The good news is if you don't want to check the slides, the very good news is these papers are published, as opposed to the slides this morning that do not really exist in the public. But this is joint research with Robin. This is in particular a working paper published by Bruegel recently. There is some data in this presentation which is actually part of a journal paper. So you'll see that it's a little bit more granular and empirical on the role of China's industrial policy. That paper is all about what China says it's going to do as opposed to what China really does. It's this idea of words versus deeds, which, and that's a paper that you can already check. This working paper is really about lessons for Europe. So we thought we would present mostly this one because the whole idea of this event is to gather some comments and discussions on what Europe should do, how Europe should understand, I wouldn't say do, China's industrial policy. Because the first thing I think we find is that we might not fully understand what it is. We have our own idea of what industrial policy is about, but China's industrial policy is a very different animal. So we cannot just replicate or draw lessons for us to apply, because these are two different things. And that's probably the most important message of the paper. So I'll only cover the very beginning, I think, and then Robin's going to do the bulk of the work. No, okay, I'll do 3. Okay, because we had this discussion and lessons for Europe. He's smiling, so I'm feeling very tired, so that's why I pushed Robin, but it didn't work. So China's industrial policy. Why is it relevant? Of course, I mean, I don't even need to really go through this. It's relevant because everybody talks about it. Look at all of the decisions here in Europe on things that we would never have imagined. You had to have these tariffs, or because this China's industrial policy is becoming central to the discussion of our own market. It's not about China's market anymore. It's about our market. So this is humongously important for us and for the US, because would the US have gone through IRA? Would the US have introduced the Inflation Reduction Act without China's having conducted massive industrial policy? Maybe not. So, it is extremely important. So if it's important, why not figure out how it works rather than just, have a kind of a virtual idea of what this is about? And we really tried to do that in this paper, to go in detail as to how it works and then draw lessons for Europe. So I'm going to pass the floor to Robin. Here you go.
I only need the small thing.
Sorry, you have that. Okay.
Yes,
Sure.
thanks. Okay, so China's industrial policy. First question is, how does China conduct industrial policy? And from the beginning, we have to acknowledge a basic fact is that China's institutional culture and China's system is a bit different from what we know in Europe and what we are used to in the West in general. And this has historical roots. I mean, the Chinese state has rarely been challenged by an institutions such as the aristocracy, science, the church, etc., etc. So naturally speaking, that implies that the Chinese state has the authority to be more guiding or to be more dominant in the economy. And we can see this by looking at the fact that a lot of state-owned enterprises are still very relevant in some sectors, notably in sectors that the 5-year plans always title as the lifelines of the economy. but also in other sectors such as still automotive, there are some SOEs. And then SOEs, and this is very important also in the context of industrial policy, there has been since basically since the PRC, this fact that SOEs are favored in access to finance. As an SOE, it's easy to get a credit because you have an implicit government guarantee, and the bank lends to you because if the loan goes bad, then the government can jump in and the bank is fine. Private enterprises who do not have a long track record of innovativeness or of industrial capacity, they find it hard to compete in access to finance with SOEs. And so part of the idea of China's industrial policy, and it's quite interesting, is to alleviate this kind of asymmetry in access to finance by saying, okay, we're also going to channel subsidies or equity investment into private companies, but we condition that on the strategic goals of the state. Voila, here are Chinese firms, total assets by industry. We can see that SOEs are still dominant in telecom, energy, infrastructure, airlines, utilities. So these are kind of really what is the basis of the economy. And then in sectors where you might need more innovation, such as semiconductors, renewables, ICT, the private enterprises are more dominant. Here's again a graph on access to finance. So funding costs for SOEs tend to be generally lower than for private enterprises, especially also the effective tax rate. Going from that, we can take a step further and we can look at how is China conducting policy planning. So we all know that China is publishing 5-year plans, and these 5-year plans, they are kind of the guidance for the economy on the highest level. And then below these 5-year plans, there are other 5-year plans. So the 5-year plans are basically, they are published by the NDRC, by the National Development and Reform Commission. And that's kind of a Chinese super ministry. I mean, it's like in Germany, you know, the Ministry of Finance. Every politician wants to get the Ministry of Finance. The NDRC is also a very influential institution. And then based on the 5-year plans that the NDRC publishes, other agencies publish their interpretation of the 5-year plan or what they can do in order to realize the 5-year plan. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs might say, look, we have this in our foreign affairs strategy in order to implement the 5-year plan. And then these 5-year plans are also complemented by sector-specific plans. For example, Made in China 2025 is a complement to the 14th 5-year plan of 2015, which details out how the modernization of the manufacturing sector, which is subject in the 5-year plan, should be conducted or should be realized. And Made in China itself is I mean, in terms of industrial policy, of course, is very important and by now very well known. Details out a couple of sectors. Advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, transportation equipment, aerospace, new energy vehicles. Some of these sectors were already in the strategic emerging industries that were published 5 years earlier. And then Made in China is again complemented by an SME development plan, and as another complement of the SME development plan, we have the so-called 10,000 Little Giants initiative, which has been launched in 2018 and is now very much in discussion in China. Everybody knows it. And the 10,000 Little Giant initiative is a kind of, is very much to be understood as a real complement because it focuses on what 5-year plans always call base industries. So basic materials, advanced equipment, machinery, chemicals, everything that the economy needs in order to realize the goal of bringing up the strategic sectors detailed out in the Made in China 2025. And on social media in China is often referred to Germany's hidden champions. If you go to Germany, you find a lot of influential suppliers who cluster around big companies such as Mercedes, BMW in the south of Germany, for example. Et voilà. So. And we did an empirical analysis on some of the Little Giant companies. The Little Giant companies are announced publicly, so we can find actually some of them on the stock market, and we can see what are the characteristics of these companies. And what is very interesting is the criteria that you have to fulfill in order to become a 10,000 little giant company is generally confirmed, or is generally fulfilled by these companies, except for one big thing, which is the main business income is not in line with the requirements. So in the requirements it says a company has to have their main business has to have a share of main business income into total revenue of above 70%. So it has to be a specialized company. It has to be a niche company, and we see that apparently the Chinese government has problems with finding companies that have this niche. Other than that, these companies tend to be in some of the batches. So this was an initiative that was carried out in several batches over several years. These companies are indeed more R&D intense. They are smaller in size. So the Chinese government is really trying to bring up these small equipment manufacturers and turning them into champions that can actually compete with equipment manufacturers that from which China has to import, so foreign companies. Okay, so if we go into the specific instruments of China's industrial policy, everybody is talking about subsidies. We see indeed that based on a sample of listed firms, or based on the universe of listed firms, we see indeed that within China, the amount of subsidies given to companies has doubled from 2015 to 2022. And the share of companies receiving subsidies has gone almost to 100%. Now, I have to say this is based on listed firms, and listed firms are not necessarily representative. A lot of small companies we do not find in the sample of listed firms. This is because the agencies have stopped publishing representative industry survey data in 2013, and from there on we're a bit blind when it comes to the Chinese economy, but we can still feel a bit of the pulse of what is going on. If we look at the sectoral classification, it's not really a big surprise. So those sectors that have the highest subsidy intensity are also those who are most supported by Made in China 2025, general purpose semiconductors, computer parts, drug discovery, biotechnology, there we have it, rail, aerospace and defense, medical supplies, pharmaceuticals, etc., etc. So here, not a big surprise, but if we look at the share of subsidies in total revenue, we actually see that it doesn't go really beyond 2%. Most of it actually hovers around 1.2, 1.4%. So it makes a difference, but it's not super critical. What is more interesting are these so-called government guidance funds. This is part of the government not to only use subsidies, but also equity investment as a way to inject money into the economy and into strategic sectors. We see that government guidance funds have proliferated since 2015, 2016. These are funds that are set up by a government agency. Most of them are actually on the local level. And then the goal is to get some money from the government itself, pool also money from SOEs, pool also money from private companies, and then have the fund managed mostly by a private manager who has the incentive to invest in the most profitable and promising companies. Voila. Again, so most of these, one of the most well-known government guidance funds, actually the big fund for the semiconductor industry. Round 3 was recently announced with a lot of money, but actually, if we look at where these government guidance funds are in the administrative hierarchy, we see that most of them are actually on the local level. And there's no clear definition or no clear legal separation between the government guidance funds and the venture capital fund. So many of these government guidance funds are also on the local level, venture capital funds with government money. And if we look at the investment, this is data from 2017 to 2019. Where the money is going is no surprise: advanced manufacturing, healthcare, biopharmaceuticals. I mean, this is all made in China 2025 again. So it's really a way of strategically investing the money of the government. Equity investment also is channeled into the economy through the sovereign wealth funds. China has found a way here to use its foreign exchange reserves. And if we look at the China Investment Corporation, which is China's largest sovereign wealth fund, the money is going into much of China's platform economy. So if you, for example, if you go to China, you don't use Uber, you use a company that is called Didi Chuxing, which is the same as Uber, but with integrated into the Chinese ecosystem of digital technologies. And Didi Chuxing has received a lot of funding, so 4.5 billion US dollars in 2016, a little bit less in 2015, a little bit less in 2016. 2015, it was at a fierce price war with Uber on the domestic Chinese market. Ant Group also has received funding from the CIC. Voila, so this is another way of injecting money into the economy. Then a wholly owned subsidiary of China Investment Corporation is the Central Huijin, and the Central Huijin in the early 2000s has been instrumental in providing the banking sector with additional finance, and managers from the Central Huijin also always secure up to 1/3 of the seats of the board of directors of these banks. And they're actively involved in both reforming the governance structure of the banks and in telling the banks essentially which way to go forward. So it's another way how the government can influence the decision of funds to be distributed. And the banking sector is something very interesting in general, because we used to focus a lot on the when we talk about industrial policy, on the central state-owned banks and the central commercial banks and the central, there are three policy banks. But essentially on the local level, we can also suspect that the government is heavily influencing the distribution of funds, because essentially the directors of local, even if they're commercial banks, even if they're officially private banks, those governors are appointed by the party secretary, and we can definitely infer that that there is some collusion going on. Okay, so one interesting thing with China's industrial policy is that, as I said earlier, it's part of the reason why China is conducting industrial policy is that it tries to alleviate the imbalance in access to finance of private companies vis-a-vis state-owned companies. And this is something that we were talking to among others, government officials, is something that is well understood and is intentional. So, for example, one can be a little giant company, and then it is easier for one to get listed at the stock market. So if you look at the share of little giant companies in new listings at the stock market, almost at 40% in 2022, still at 35% on 2023. Voila, so it creates an opportunity for private companies to get access to finance from outside sources, including the stock markets, banks, etc. There are many other ways in which especially local government officials can control the access of financing through, for example, preferential land allocation. So in China, all land is owned by the state, and the state can use this land in order to advance its policies, essentially. Tax rebates, selective creation of essentially business networks. So we can imagine local governments a bit like a chamber of commerce. If you're in, very good for you. You get a lot of opportunities. The government comes and asks, do you need a road? Do you need some bureaucratic support here, etc., etc.? We can connect you to suppliers, etc. Et voilà, there's many ways how China can distribute funds strategically, and we see now whether it's...
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah.
I'll be brief because this session is a bit shorter. We have up to 15, so I'm doing your... And I'm self-imposing some rigor here to finish on time, which is going to mean that I will jump on the slides and you can read the paper. But what I wanted to say is that from Robin's presentation, two things to take away, which I don't want to forget. One is that subsidies, which is what we're focusing on, by the way, are the tip of the iceberg, are literally the tip of the iceberg. and I know our investigations are broader and everything we want to say, but a lot of what Robin has shown is difficult word, just impossible to figure out, to make it very simple. Yeah, I mean, government guided funds or CIC, how can you assign that to a level of industrial policy or subsidy or support? It's impossible. So we're here trying to catch a train that has gone. And I think that this is why probably what we need to look at is not so much only the instruments, but is it working? I mean, at the very end. And I think one thing Robin showed, which is this journal paper I mentioned, is very interesting, is that the fact that China is moving up the ladder, I mean, all of the great things that China has done, no doubt about it, comes across as a very, so just the little giants, yeah, the results you showed on our paper. So just imagine, those results basically say that the companies receiving the money are not the companies in the sectors they're trying to support. So is it coincidental that it works? Is it because China is very dynamic? I mean, it's not because of industrial policy. I mean, maybe the money is not assigned to the companies that are doing best, but those doing best are doing best. You know, it's like, so we can't really confirm that what is helping China move up the ladder is industrial policy, just by that simple result, because the money is not going to the companies in the sectors they're trying to protect. So it's a big finding. These companies, though, are innovative. Robin showed it. They are the most innovative, but they're not in the sectors they're trying to protect. So maybe it does work because the companies are good, but they're not doing what we think they're doing. So this all to show that I think we're trying to catch, air here. We can't replicate this model. It's just not in our interest, probably, because our economies work very differently. So the whole idea of this paper is to show that, no more. And then, I'll just jump on it, because we go through sectors to make the point that, yes, we hear China is very successful in industrial policy, but actually there are also failures in some sectors. It's not that everything is very successful. By success, we have here a graph that says it all. This is the difference in value added in exports between China and every country you can imagine, including the EU. So that line is China with the US. It's just mind-boggling, because remember the first paper we showed you is the US is doing great in emerging technologies, and is, but actually when you look at value added of exports, which is in a way, as Reinhilde was saying, okay, the use of it, yeah, not so much the innovation, but the use of it, especially for industrial use, China is just killing everybody else. Europe less so than the US, and I think that's quite interesting. Maybe that's the origin of IRA. So I'll just go to a few things like that look successful. So I'll just use probably this example and I'll move on. Wow, I mean, China is, if you look at the robot density coming at the lowest end in 2016, is now at the level of Japan. Certainly not like Korea. Korea is still like, but the thing is this natural? And in the paper, and Robin did a little bit of research about this, it's interesting how this happens, is that local governments are rewarded if they robotize factories in their localities. But are they robotizing the right companies or the right factories? We don't really know. I mean, maybe they're putting robots where we would need any robots, because the incentive is just install the robots. So, there's a lot of things that to me cannot just be solved by how many robots are there, but really are the robots where they should be. And I think that's a much tougher ball game. So we go, as I said, space, where is it not as successful, biotech, half-half, semiconductors, as you can imagine. Well, this is a very successful one if you think about it in terms of railway. Shipbuilding, very successful one. But I think basically my point is that I'm trying to make, just rushing here, is that the degree of success is very different across sectors. So electrical equipment is great, but others are not great. So it can't only be made in China 2025, because then it would be more similar. So there has to be something maybe on the degree of innovation of the sector, the role of private companies, how open it is, the role of local. I mean, it is not only about top-down industrial policy, because otherwise the sectors would have moved more equally. The best on earth is new energy. Yeah, I mean, we know that. We suffer from that in a way because we used to have an industry in Europe. So you can see that, again, the success is very different. And overall, the reality is that, imagine, yes, we conceive that the success is 80% on average per sector. Say, total factor productivity is not budging. It's like, it's actually at the very same level, if not lower. So, you know, if you think about it, how can this be? That you move up the ladder so massively, but you don't increase total factor productivity. So there's a lot of unknowns here. That is really what we wanted to highlight. And why? Well, and the literature goes through all of them. Yeah, local favoritism. Maybe that's why you give the money to the companies that are not even doing what you are supposedly supporting. Or chronism. Yeah, I mean, the role of local governments, or business environment being very, very lousy now that, yes, you get the money, but maybe you just save it. You don't use it for industrial purposes, or, you know, I think the whole idea is there's many channels we can't figure out. This is not a kind of rule-based type industrial policy. It's really a very like ad hoc based industrial policy. And I think the main thing, I'm going to go to the conclusions, because this is, I mean, I just want to say one more thing to end, because I want to echo what George Magnus said before. I could finish here by saying, because total factor productivity does not increase in China, it's not working. I could leave it there. But the reality is China may have a different objective, which is what George said. Maybe the objective is self-reliance. Maybe the objective is not to be too dependent on the US. And on that front, China is doing well. So, you know, I just think we need to put in our equation this double objective, perhaps even with one being more important, I mean, this idea of not being dependent on the US. And I think if you measure everything I've said on that objective, maybe the glass is fuller than if I focus on growth. So lessons for Europe. This is, I promise, one slide and we're done. So the basic lesson is we cannot extrapolate. We just cannot say, okay, this is China's industrial policy, where's ours? And just benchmark our industrial policy to that of China. I think this is impossible, much more than with the US. Because just what Robin said is so intense in my head. China has basically state capitalism, let's face it, for better or worse. That means supporting the SOEs. I mean, the state basically running the economy. And industrial policy, to a large extent, is to minimize the harm of that model, because a lot of money goes to the private sector, or as Robin was saying, to offer them access to the stock market, yeah? Meaning to reduce the burden for the private sector of that state-driven capitalism. So it's interesting. It's the opposite of our idea of industrial policy. It's making it easier for the private sector. So it's like, wow, it's not in our mind, because we wouldn't say private versus public. We would use rule-based type decision. And this is not what China's industrial policy is about. So this is why we say China's institutional setup makes industrial policy a second best option compared to me, of course, market-driven economy. At least they have industrial policy. This is the way we are kind of end up reading this. And therefore, it's impossible for us to copycat or imitate or, you know, or reflect on using China as an example for us. But there is one thing we can at least learn: the role of economies of scale. Most of the success stories that we've shown you here would not have happened without economies of scale. No matter whether the subsidies would have been double, triple, fourfold, no. The key is, of course, the economies of scale enable that industrial policy. And I think we need to learn this. We need to realize that we're missing on that, the size of a market, on a fully integrated single market. So that's the key conclusion, and I think we're done. And
yes, thank you very much. Again, very challenging presentation and a lot of facts and figures that we need to be aware of. In terms of evaluating industrial policy, does it work or not in China? I agree we need to look at different kinds of instruments, also including the regulatory setting as well here. But it's in the end really looking at what works and what doesn't work. I fully agree with you. But then we really also need to identify, is it working or not working in terms of who gets it, the selection, versus really the treatment. And if there is a treatment effect, is that somehow creating an unlevel playing field for European companies, because then that's something we need to take into account here. Just want to add one point to this, the economies of scale matter here. Indeed, China has the advantage of being a big market here, a big market which is also very competitive. And in that respect, perhaps part of the purpose of industrial policy is not just to pick one winner, but to make sure, even if you have companies that are subsidized but won't win, if they provide enough competitive challenge for the one who are winners here, then you may be betting on really economies of scale generated from the subsidy policies, which may also involve way more losses than what we would actually. But I think we really are looking forward to having the pleasure of having David Rodriguez Colmenero, who is in charge of international relationships at DG Growth here, in charge of covering the region China, Korea, and Taiwan here. So we're very interested in seeing what your perspective is in terms of industrial policy in China and how you see that as a challenge, an opportunity, or not. Here, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I don't know if this is working. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. This is the first time I participate in this kind of event, so I'm very happy to be here. Probably a new face for many of you. If there's one thing that I wanted to keep in mind during my presentation is that I come from DG Grow, not DG Trade. I know there's a lot of enthusiasm today over the sort of tariffs, the provisional tariffs on EVs. So unfortunately, I won't be able to talk about that because it's not my service that deals with that. So just making sure that's clear from the get-go. I will do a very short intervention because we're running low on time. Also because there were many questions in the previous sessions, and I would like to also give an opportunity to people to ask questions. Same disclaimer as Tim, I do not speak on behalf of the Commission. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I would be able to, because industrial policy has become such a hot topic recently. There are differences of opinion between different member states, different commissioners, I probably shouldn't say that, and with the outcome of the European elections, the panoramic view looks even more uncertain. So clearly a very important topic today, and the relationship with China is at the heart of it. Although, of course, there are other elements at play, like the relationship with the US, and in particular the IRA and other subsidy schemes that are sort of, in a way, forcing the hand of the EU to respond and to behave or to adapt a little bit to all of this. We have reports coming out. We have the Letta report on single market. We have the Draghi report on competitiveness. So clearly there's a fertile ground for discussion. So in this context, this presentation is very, very timely, very, very important, because we need to understand the perspective of China, how they deal with their industrial policy, if we are to adapt. And that's something that this presentation, I think, did very well. And it's very, very important to have it right now. I mean, we have a lot of projects currently ongoing on trying to upskill our knowledge, level the playing field on the knowledge that we have with regards to the Chinese industrial policy. This is for a variety of reasons, in particular because there's a lack of transparency in the way that the Chinese conduct their industrial policy, but also because of the key word that Alicia kept saying, the scale, right? The scale of industrial policy in China is huge, is very impressive. They touch upon so many different sectors. They have so many subsidies, as we saw before. One thing that I also take away is the scale of the inefficiencies as well in the way that they run, the kind of waste, economic waste that it generates. I want to focus my intervention on the kind of lessons for the EU, and right off the bat I would like to say that we need to get the right conclusions for the EU. If we're looking at what the Chinese are doing, if we're looking at all the subsidization, which is a path that perhaps we will start walking towards. I don't have any privileged information, of course, but it's something that anyone can think about in terms of where we might go. This is a lesson that we should also keep in mind, that with all this scale and all these subsidies that are being given, there are potential for economic waste. And that's something that we need to balance and see if it's something that we can tolerate in our single market. So this overview was very valuable. I think for me personally, also for the audience. There was a slide before, and just to close the aspect of the economic waste, on the guidance funds and the difference between the stated objective and the achieved objective. I think it's one that I think is very important that people should really absorb in terms of this idea of really trying to take some of the elements that are good or that are helping the Chinese economy and industrial ecosystems to grow, but also not forgetting that they come with some strings attached, and this kind of economic waste could be one of those elements. One comment that I would like to make is that when it comes to Chinese industrial policy, one thing that we heard from the different presentations before is that what the Chinese are trying to achieve is global dominance in some sectors, leadership, but also dominance. Let's not forget the role that our companies have in this, right? I mean, we have companies that are investing in China, and the other element of the Chinese industrial strategy is the replacement of the substitution of the products that they import and that they're dependent on from the Chinese perspective. So I think that should make us really reflect what the future of the relationship should look like. There was a discussion earlier about the new productive forces, and this is something that, the way I look at it, it seems to be like really targeting the sectors where the EU has some technological dominance, or is kind of like in the tip of the spear in terms of research and in terms of bringing these technologies to market, but they want to go beyond, replace, and then dominate global supply chains in this regard. So that's something that we need to keep in mind if we want to make sure that the relationship with China keeps working for the EU, because that's really at the heart of everything. Over the past few years, there has been an evolution in the way that we understand the relationship with China. And while the famous triptych of rivalry, competition, and partnership is still valid, it's still the official policy of the EU, there are certain elements on the rivalry and competition aspects that are becoming more and more to the fore. And then we need to think about how we rebalance this and make sure that the relationship works for us. Another aspect that I think is interesting is, over the next 6 months, there will be the campaign and elections in the US. I think whatever shape the new government and administration takes, there will probably be kind of still continuing this policy of decoupling from China, and that will have repercussions on the EU. For instance, in the recent example of the tariffs, that were introduced that that can have the potential to move trade from China to the U.S. back to Europe, which could exacerbate some of the dependencies that we have in some critical sectors, but also put more pressure on our local manufacturers who want to compete in the EU single market with heavily subsidized products from China. So there will be this pressure from the US, probably more so if Trump comes in. But I think our relationship with China is different than the one that the US has. We have, I think in 2023, we imported about 100 billion euros more than the US did. We have, I think, 40 to 50 billion euros more foreign direct investment in China. So I think our companies and our supply chains are more exposed than those of the US. So we need to really think about what we're going to be doing in terms of, will we be following the US in its the coupling journey, or will we try to maintain some kind of middle ground and trying to mediate between the two superpowers, at least for as long as we have the level of dependencies on China that we currently have. So I think regardless of what we choose, two elements will stand out in our relationship with China. One of it, and I'm getting to the point that you wanted me to talk about, which is the scale of the EU. I'm not looking at it from the scale of the industrial policy, but I'm thinking of the scale of the single market as a destination. China has huge scale. The EU has scale that is less, but it's a very coherent market that the Chinese are very interested in maintaining access to. The US has recently, I mean, for several years now, but also very recently increased tariffs and really fencing its economy to Chinese products. Other economies are following suit. India recently also announced tariffs in the solar sector for Chinese products, and this is creating pressure on Chinese manufacturers to find another place to sell its high-tech products, its value-added products. And for the time being, the EU remains the biggest market that they have at their disposal. This gives us some leverage. It gives us some leverage also because we have this series of instruments that we have developed that we're starting to use. We have the foreign subsidies regulation, we have the international procurement instrument, the trade defense instruments. So we're really putting those to use, and I think this is creating, in addition of leverage, credibility, which is something that is, I would say that maybe the EU sometimes struggles with because we have so many member states with different opinions. There seems to be a bit of a convergence in the way that we look at the China question, and at least an acknowledgement that we need to work together in order to really tackle the situation in an effective way. And then one other thing, and with this I will finish, that I want to talk about is the investment angle. So what we're seeing is new trends in investment. One of these trends is that, and I don't want to overstate this because recently we've learned that investment from China to the EU has reached the levels of 2010 in terms of being some of the lowest over the past 15 years. So, let's not create the impression that there is this new wave of investment or anything like that. But the profile of the way that investment is being done from China to the EU has changed. And part of it is because SOEs are investing less, so you have more private companies investing. And the other thing is the kind of growth of greenfield investment. Greenfield investment is interesting because from a competition perspective, it doesn't generate, it's not so obvious that it challenges the kind of competitive situation in the single market. It takes a little bit of really thinking about the specific products, the specific sectors, much more so than acquisitions. There's much less acquisitions than before. And I think that creates a little bit of an opportunity to reshift a bit the economic relationship. Also because these kinds of investments have the added benefit that they achieve some of the objectives of the EU, some of which have to do with reshoring and making sure that our supply chains in Europe remain strong. And it all depends on the quality of the investment that comes in. If it's just assembly of products, then maybe it's less interesting than developing batteries, especially if it's in a joint venture capacity with some kind of technology transfer, voluntary of course. If all of these conditions are met, there is a chance that their relationship could be based on this more positive aspect, I would say. And so that's something that we should think about. It's a question that we talked about at some point in one of those presentations. The idea that could you de-risk in the form of kind of making our supply chains in Europe stronger from China with the help of Chinese companies. It's a bit of a provocative and spicy idea, but it's something that I think will be interesting to think about. I think I will leave it there so that people can ask questions.
Thanks very much, and we're very happy that you're willing to share your views on this here. I was actually thinking when you're saying DG Growth, I'm not from DG Trade, I think actually also the whole industrial policy making process in Europe is also pretty complicated. Here we have the EU level, the member states, the regional levels, the different policy competences. So I think also getting a better grip on how this is done in Europe is equally complicated here. So I'd like to open the floor for discussion. We still have some 10 minutes left here. And yeah, we already have one question, 2 questions. Yeah, and we have a walking mic or not?
Thank you for this great presentation and comments from David. I'm Gosia Akimov. I also work for the European Commission, but I actually am a researcher myself, and I work for the Joint Research Center. The questions I have relate to the first presentation. Myself, I work on a green energy sector, and something I noticed in your presentation that really surprised me was just how little money actually, according to your graphs, goes to the green energy sector. And especially given that EVs are one of the strategic products that were listed in a MIG-25 strategy. From your graphs at least, maybe they are hidden somewhere, these products, among electronic goods, I'm not sure. They don't seem to be there for the subsidy. So I'm just wondering where this disparity comes from. And the same goes for solar panels, for wind turbines. I mean, these are the main products that are flooding our market. So we really have an interest in understanding the subsidy level, when it started, how it's going, and they don't seem to be there on the graph. So I would like to maybe go back to those graphs and comment a little bit why they're not there. And also another question I have, something that I noticed in my own research a lot with reference to the non-market instruments in China is, for example, something like price fixing for energy. And I'm just wondering if you also listed that among your kind of non-market instruments, subsidy-like strategies, and if you can comment a little bit. And yeah, I also have a question to David, but maybe we can talk later about that.
Okay, very short then, because we also went... no other question. No? Okay, so then we have
I just have the similar question. So for last years, the EU issues act on the regulations on foreign subsidies distorting the EU's internal market. So this actually have some new regulations for the foreign subsidies, but not compatible with the WTO's subsidy rules. So my question is, if for this foreign subsidies concept, will EU continue to strengthen WTO, or will EU just will damage the WTO's consensus? The first question. Second question is actually for China's growing innovation is not only any policy will create winners and losers, but particularly the policy institution should create the potential huge predictable market or the certainties for the capital, for the business. So China, that's for the many sectors, that create the potential uncertainties or put the certainties and predictable market for the foreign capital. You can find that China still was the second largest FDI investment last year, according. So this if China's government try to distort the market or try to use the top down, actually they will create quite a lot of losers. Will cannot create so many certainties for foreign capitals. So this my question is: if currently China's policy still looks much more predictable certainties for foreign capitals in China's innovation area. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's very important questions in terms of the level playing field around the subsidies here and the WTO compatibility. And your question I also interpret in terms of do these subsidies go to certain industries, or are they way more focused on some particular products like solar panels, or more broader here? So how targeted are they here? We also have there are any more questions in the... So we had also on Slido, one question was more on, it's not on the list, but it's on my list. Here is what role would actually, when the Chinese government takes an ownership position in companies, what does it imply, not just only in terms of financing, but also in terms of what influence do they have on the control of the company and management of the company here? And then the question on, and then the other question is on what does that mean in terms of our EU companies, private companies, when they would invest in Europe, in China, sorry, how do they deal with this industrial policy targeted at Chinese state-owned companies?
Maybe we only have 3 minutes, so Robin, you want to start? Okay. Yes.
Okay.
One and a half each. Let's go.
Okay, so I want to shortly comment on the
so.
renewable energy, especially the solar panel. So solar panel is industry is something that came up already before our period under investigation in our data. This is something that was brought up in the 2010s via subsidization. There's also some research on that. But then actually what happened afterwards is that the industry took off with especially what was driving the industry was especially knowledge accumulation. So China learned how to manage the factories, how to manage the machinery within the factories. The machinery also was more and more China produced and benefited from the proliferation of digital supply chains. So this is something that helped the solar industry also to take off. I also learned that a solar panel loses energy efficiency if actually the machinery is not really optimized, and if the people who work in the factories do not know how to handle the factories or how to handle the machinery within the factories. About the EVs, this is something that is quite interesting. So some of the subsidies are actually in the upstream sector. So for example, aluminium and steel. It's generally hard to dissect how exactly China's EV market became what it currently is. There are some factors that play in there. One is digital supply chains. Again, digital platforms to manage supply chains. It's very easy for a producer of any kind of equipment or of any product to be matched with a suitable supplier via digital platforms. Then there's also the subsidization of charging stations, which has propelled the industry ahead. Huawei, for example, is now making and installing charging station with government help. And then there's the fact that the EV market is just incredibly competitive. I was in China in April, and when you take a taxi in any city from A to B, you will see on the street 15 different electric vehicle brands, some of which you have never heard before in Europe. I mean, we know BRD, we know Zeekr, we know NIO by now, but there are many, many, many more. So the competition is enormous, and it probably makes sense for a company to target market share over profitability in this setup. So.
Vehicles, maybe then also answer his question in the terms of the extent to which this anti-subsidy rules will actually be looking also at the level playing field, distorting value of these subsidies or not. Because the examples you mentioned may not be distortive.
Can we have a consensus on the subsidies based on the WTO rules or just based on the EU's own standards?
WTO. It's
Yep.
a WTO investigation. The
Yep.
answer is on the newspaper. It's a WTO investigation.
Yep.
Anyway,
So now that you have the floor,
because we don't want to take time from it. So I'll be very brief. I think one thing that maybe I don't think we showed this time on the role of energy subsidization, I would say that that's crucial not only in China but in many Asian economies. But most importantly, the role of land subsidization, the access to land, that's enormous. Probably much bigger than any subsidy we're showing here. Maybe subsidies are equally distributed among foreign and local companies. Land might not. So we cannot capture, in other words, whether it's the level playing field or the size of the subsidization with subsidies. It's impossible. So I think we need to move beyond. This is for our defensive measures. But a different thing that we've been discussing here is whether we should at all imitate this, because it's just not our economic model. Just ultimately, I think on the idea of competition, which I understand we hear all the time, China is so competitive. This is why this is happening. Only one number, and I leave it there. 70% of the subsidies, which again are the tip of the iceberg, I fully agree, go to loss-making companies. So many of the cars that Robin was seeing in Beijing are loss-making institutions. That's the reality. So some may be very competitive, I have no doubt about it, but not all are. Some are there because they need to be there. The local governments are subsidizing. So going back to your point, there is a lot of misallocation of resources. And you can only do that if you have 50% of savings to the GDP. We should not try that out with our level of savings. It's a different economy.
Yeah, it's indeed a different economy. I think we can conclude on it. David, do you want to still use? Yeah. Okay. So then, thanks a lot for the participants in this panel here, and we would like to close actually by having another part of the Commission, DG RTD, which is very much involved in the science, technology, and innovation component of our policy here, and we have Nienke Buisman, who will. There she is. Yeah, Nienke Buisman, who's head of unit at DG RTD and in charge also of international relations, but for science and technology here, to give your final thoughts on this for this audience. Nienke, can you take the floor? So we won't ask you about electric vehicles.
Yeah, I'm not an expert, so. But thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here and see all of you. Unfortunately, I couldn't follow your discussion, so I hope not to be too much out of touch with the discussions you had this morning. But that's our lives. We always have to do several things at the same time. So yeah, thanks again for inviting me. I have a few things that I would like to share with you today. First of all, a quote. Getting China right has never been more important than today. You probably recognize this, comes from President von der Leyen from last year. And we believe in DG Research and Innovation that this remains very relevant in a context, especially where accessing information from China has become increasingly difficult. Due to challenges in conducting research on the field, data sets have been closed, raising concerns linked to regulatory measures such as the data security law and the update of the counter-espionage law. And it is within these complexities that the Commission, DG Research and Innovation, pays specific attention to enhancing, developing the knowledge with organizations as yours as we are today. And since 2021, we have mobilized over 10 million euros from Horizon Europe to support this. And there are currently 3 different projects working on enhancing independent knowledge on contemporary China in Europe, and DWARC is one of these projects. So in my intervention, I would like to start by giving you a broader policy reflection that is guiding our work in international cooperation in research and innovation. And then afterwards, I will focus specifically on how our cooperation with China has evolved over the last years. Of course, you have heard it many times, I'm sure. Innovation has acquired increasing geopolitical relevance and is increasingly linked to strategic autonomy, economic and research security. And the European Economic Security Strategy was actually an important step, or is an important step that the EU is taking to enhance its capability to mitigate and anticipate risks linked to supply chains, resilience, security of critical infrastructures and technologies, or potential dependencies. I would like to focus more specifically on research and innovation, of course, given where I'm coming from. The global approach strategy still stands in this field as well, and we have increased our focus on research security, both within the EU framework program Horizon Europe, as well as in our cooperation with the member states. On one hand, in Horizon Europe, we're putting risk appraisal measures in place and have already mobilized several safeguarding tools over the last years. In our cooperation with the member states, we have developed over the last months a council recommendation on research security that was adopted on the 23rd of May. And this is very much about raising awareness and building the capacity at all levels in the EU. So at national level, but also and especially in the stakeholder community. Now moving to China, we see China moving fast to shape its industrial and innovation policy in support of national security and economic development, and that a strong emphasis is given by the government on technology self-sufficiency and advancement in emerging tech. Yeah, I'm sure you have looked at the numbers many times, including today. China has become a top R&D spender, surpassing the EU 27, but also the restructuring of the Ministry of Science and Technology, the establishment of a new Central Commission for Science and Technology, and recent changes in the Chinese Academy of Science, underlying to what extent STI has become China's first policy priority. On the EU side, since 2019, we have been working to remodulate bilateral cooperation in research and innovation, really basing it on a careful assessment of opportunities and risks. We started to discuss with China in 2019 a joint roadmap for the future of EU-China cooperation in science, technology, and innovation. And the aim of this roadmap is really to work towards a balanced and mutual beneficial cooperation environment. We're focusing on research and innovation framework conditions, from issues going from IP protection to open science. And the advancement of these discussions on the roadmap really determine the quality and the intensity of our cooperation in research and innovation, especially the way we are using Horizon Europe towards this effect. But negotiations remain very complex with regard to framework conditions linked to innovation, such as IP, for example. But we now have substantial agreement, at least on paper, on research framework conditions we had a big delegation from the Ministry of Science and Technology with us over to Brussels last week, led by DG Daigang, and we spent 2 days together. We closed the discussions on the research framework conditions. So, yeah, there are areas, of course, where we have seen a positive development, such as in ethics, where, for example, the opinions on strengthening the ethical governance of science and technology issued in March 22 by the CPC Central Committee, and the State Council called for a drafting of catalogs of ethically high-risk actions. But yeah, there are also many examples where imbalances persist. I have several here that I can give as an example. Once again, IP, according to the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China's 2023 Business Confidence Survey, 45% of respondents replied that enforcement of Chinese IP protection laws is still inadequate, and forced technology transfer is still being reported. Another example on, for example, standardization, EU companies continue to experience significant barriers for active participation in Chinese standardization technical committees. So due to the slow progress in our negotiations on innovation and the roadmap, we have decided to stop any collaboration at high TRL, so innovation actions in Horizon Europe in the current work program. But at the same time, in parallel, we do continue to promote collaborative research in tackling global challenges. And we have 2 big R&I flagships together on food, agriculture, and biosolutions, as well as on climate change and biodiversity. And in the current work program from Horizon Europe, we have co-invested 86 million in these joint projects that are now starting or under evaluation. Another very important point of attention at the moment and already since a while is the coordination, of course, with the member states. This is really key to seek for alignment in our policies, including on the roadmap, but not only. And from our own research, we also see that this alignment is happening, especially at the national level, where most of the joint calls we're all doing are in the same fields, such as environmental protection, agriculture, health, etc. But on the other hand, we also looked at collaborations more at the stakeholder level, so Chinese universities and research organizations, where the picture is a very different one. We see co-publication trends that have substantially increased over the last 10 years, and also in areas such as applied sciences, artificial intelligence, networking, and telecommunications. But we want to cooperate with China. It's not in our interest to close cooperation entirely, but we really believe that we need to get the balance right, especially in terms of framework conditions, and this is at the policy level continuously and will be our message. So maybe linking it a bit to your discussions today, it's also of great support. My colleagues were here during the entire session. It should support the Commission's work to further decode China's innovation landscape and industrial policy. And yes, I will not speak about the announcement from yesterday. I understand you have spoken about it enough. We welcome the paper as well, as you underlined and discussed even in the session before. Subsidies are, of course, only one part of Chinese industrial policy. As you said, the tip of the iceberg. There are several others, as we learn from your input paper and the discussions today. We also see that the industrial policy has not always been successful. So I just wanted to finish off and say these findings and the type of work that Bruegel is doing is extremely important for the European Commission. It will inform our thinking. It does inform our thinking. This is one of the reasons why
we are supporting it through Horizon Europe. It will impact our policy decisions in the field of. We will continue to focus on this. We will continue to focus on gathering the evidence, investing in our own knowledge to influence our policy making, including through Horizon Europe. And therefore, thank you very much once again for inviting us. These type of discussions, gatherings are extremely helpful, as well as all of the papers that we regularly read. Thank you very much.
Thanks, you. That's a very good way of closing this day here. It's actually what I wanted to say too here. I think in terms of takeaways, I think we've learned, first of all, that indeed an innovation-based industrial policy, we're all aware of, that's really what we need. That's in the rhetoric. We still haven't figured out how to do this here, not in Europe, not in China, not in the US. But what's very clear is that if we want to understand what to do, we need to monitor what's going on in China and in the US here. But we have to monitor not only what's done, but also how effective is it. This effectiveness is really important. And for that, this really needs to be evidence-based here. And the evidence we still need to develop further on. And that's why the work done by Alicia, Robin, and her colleagues will be very important in making sure we get this evidence base on effectiveness of innovation-based industrial policies here. And I'm very glad to hear that there is the openness on the policy side to be more evidence-based here. So we have good prospects, I think, in the future. Thanks a lot for your attention and your active participation here, and keep up the interest in this topic here, because it's too important to be neglected. Thank you.